Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still get chills thinking about that day in June 1996. My buddy Jake and I were doing a week-long backpacking trip through the Escalante area in Utah. We were both in our mid-20s then, pretty experienced hikers who'd done plenty of wilderness treks together since college. This was supposed to be just another adventure. It was our third day out, hiking across this high plateau between a gulch and Deer Creek. The landscape out there is something else. All these incredible red and tan sandstone formations against that piercing blue Utah sky. The kind of place that makes you feel tiny and insignificant in the best possible way. We'd started hiking around 7 that morning to beat the worst of the heat, but by noon, the temperature was already pushing 95 degrees. The sun was absolutely brutal. We'd been careful with our water, but we were both starting to run low. The plan was to make it to Deer Creek by mid-afternoon, where we could refill and cool off. I remember we'd stopped for a quick break, sharing some trail mix and checking the map. That's when I noticed something moving on top of one of the rock outcroppings about a quarter-mile ahead of us. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, which would have been weird since we hadn't seen anyone else for 2 days. "Jake," I said, pointing. "You see that?" He squinted against the sun and pulled his sunglasses down. "What the hell is that?" We both froze, watching. Whatever it was big, and I mean big. It was walking upright, moving deliberately along the ridge of this sandstone formation. The way it moved was human-like, but not quite right. Too fluid for its size. But what really got to me wasn't just the size, it was the color. This thing was white. Not like pale skin white or even albino white. I mean paper white, like bleached bone or printer paper. It practically glowed against the tan and orange landscape. It was the most unnatural thing I've ever seen, like something that had never been touched by the sun. We stood there watching it for maybe 30 seconds as it moved along the ridge. It seemed to be searching for something, head moving side to side, occasionally bending down to look at the ground. Then suddenly, it just ducked behind a rock outcropping and disappeared. The moment it vanished, this wave of dread washed over me. I absolutely knew that it had spotted us and was deliberately hiding. There was purpose in the way it moved, like a predator that doesn't want its prey to know it's been seen. "What the fuck was that?" Jake whispered, even though whatever it was had to be too far away to hear us. "I have no idea," I replied, my mouth suddenly dry, and not just from the heat. We looked at our map. The problem was, our planned route took us right past that outcropping to descend into Deer Creek Canyon. The water situation was getting serious. I had maybe half a liter left, and Jake wasn't much better off. With the heat rising, we needed to get to the creek. "We could go around," Jake suggested, pointing to the east. "Add maybe an hour to our hike, but avoid that, whatever it was." I nodded immediately. Something about that white figure had triggered every primal warning system in my body. "Yeah, let's do that." So we changed course, heading east, before planning to curve back down toward Deer Creek. The terrain was rougher this way, lots of loose scree that made for slow going. We were both quiet, constantly scanning the landscape around us. The feeling of being exposed was overwhelming. We'd gone maybe half a mile when I felt it. This intense sensation of being watched. It was like a physical pressure between my shoulder blades. I've never felt anything like it before or since. Without saying anything, Jake and I both turned around at the same exact moment. There it was again. The white figure had reappeared almost exactly where we'd first seen it. It was standing fully upright now, watching us. Even from that distance, I could feel its focus locked onto us. "Jesus Christ," Jake muttered. The thing was massive. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its proportions were all wrong for a human, arms too long, torso too wide. And that stark, impossible whiteness stood out against the landscape like a beacon. We both froze, staring back at it. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then, just like before, it quickly ducked behind the rocks and disappeared. "Let's move faster," I said, my voice shaking slightly. We picked up our pace as much as the terrain would allow, constantly checking behind us. Every rock formation, every shadow seemed threatening now. The heat was getting to us both. My shirt was soaked through with sweat, and I could see Jake was struggling too, but neither of us suggested slowing down. About an hour later, we finally reached the descent point to Deer Creek. The path down was steep and treacherous, but I'd never been so happy to be going downhill in my life. As we started to descend, I took one last look at the plateau behind us. I didn't see the white figure, but I swear I could still feel it watching. The descent was brutal, all loose rocks and uncertain footing. We were both so focused on not falling that we barely spoke. By the time we reached Deer Creek, we were both completely drained. I've never been so glad to see water in my life. We filled our bottles, purified the water, and drank until our stomachs hurt. We should have felt safe once we reached the creek, down in the canyon with high walls surrounding us. But that feeling of being watched never really went away. We pushed on farther than we'd planned that day, hiking until it was almost too dark to see. Neither of us wanted to camp anywhere near where we'd seen that thing. When we finally set up camp, we built a fire bigger than we needed and kept it going all night. We took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts. I don't think either of us actually got much rest. Every sound, branches cracking, rocks shifting, had us both wide awake and alert. That night, I wrote everything down in my journal, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I drew a rough sketch too, though it doesn't come close to capturing the wrongness of that figure. At the time, I didn't think of it as a Bigfoot or anything like that. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot, of course, but they were always described as brown or reddish, covered in hair. Not this stark white creature that moved with such deliberate purpose. The rest of our trip was uneventful, but we were on edge the entire time. We altered our planned route to stay in the canyons rather than return to the plateau. Neither of us wanted to risk another encounter. When we got back to civilization, we didn't really talk about what we'd seen. I think we both were trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another hiker wearing light-colored clothes, and the distance and heat made them look bigger than they were. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. No human moves like that thing did. No clothing is that unnaturally white. And nothing explains that feeling of absolute dread it triggered in both of us. For years, I didn't tell anyone else about it. It wasn't until around 2005 that I mentioned it to my friend Mark, who's really into cryptozoology and Bigfoot research. I expected him to laugh it off, but instead, he got really quiet and serious. He showed me some reports from other hikers who claimed to have seen white Bigfoot-like creatures in the Rockies and the Southwest. I've been back to the Escalante region many times since then. It's still one of the most beautiful places I've ever hiked, but I've never returned to that exact same area between the Gulch and Deer Creek. I can't bring myself to, and I've never seen anything like that white figure again. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. When I close my eyes, I can still picture it perfectly. That paper-white figure moving with such purpose across the rocky plateau, the way it deliberately hid when it realized we'd spotted it, how it reappeared to watch us leaving. Sometimes I dream about it, always the same dream. I'm alone on that plateau, and I turn around to find that white figure standing right behind me, close enough to touch. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it meant us harm or was just curious. But whatever it was, it knew we were there. It was watching us. And sometimes, when I'm hiking alone in remote areas, I still get that feeling between my shoulder blades, that pressure that tells me something is watching, and I always turn around, half expecting to see that stark white figure standing there against the landscape, watching me with whatever passes for eyes on its featureless face. Story 2. I've been hesitating to share this for almost a decade now. Part of me still doesn't want to talk about it, but I need to get this off my chest. I've been hunting in the forests around Chihalis, Washington since I was a teenager. I know those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did, until that day in early bow season about 10 years ago. It was early September, still warm enough that the trees were holding on to their summer greenery. I'd been out since dawn, moving quietly through my usual hunting grounds. Nothing special had happened during the day, just a typical hunt with a few deer sightings, but no clear shots. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to call it a day and head back to my car. My buddy Mike was supposed to meet me back at the vehicles around 5, but I got there early. I parked along this open field that borders the eastern edge of the hunting area. It's a good spot because you can see anyone coming out of the tree line from a fair distance. I was sitting in my truck for about 10 minutes, drinking some water and scrolling through my phone when I started getting antsy. Mike was taking his time, and I figured I'd step out and get some fresh air while waiting. I walked toward the tree line, stopping about 10 feet from the edge of the forest. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the field, but there was still plenty of light. That's when I first heard it. From my left, maybe 30 yards down the tree line, I heard something moving through the underbrush. Not quietly either. This was heavy movement, breaking branches, crushing leaves. My first thought was, Mike's coming out. But something felt off immediately. Mike's an experienced hunter. He wouldn't make that much noise. None of us would. It defeats the whole purpose of hunting if you're crashing through the woods like that. The footsteps continued, moving parallel to the field edge, but staying just inside the tree line. Whatever it was getting closer to where I was standing. I remember my heart starting to beat faster as the footsteps approached a spot almost directly in front of me, still hidden in the trees. "Mike!" I called out, not too loud, but enough that he would hear me if it was him. The response I got wasn't Mike. It wasn't human at all. It was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the air between us. Not like a bear's growl. I've heard those before. This was different. Lower, more intentional somehow. I froze completely. The thing, whatever it was, didn't stop moving. It just kept walking parallel to the field edge, still breaking twigs and crushing leaves. I'm 6'2", and I remember thinking that whatever made that sound had to be at least my height, maybe taller, which was especially strange because the forest floor at that point was a couple feet lower than the field where I stood. I didn't move an inch until the sounds faded away to my right. My truck was maybe 20 yards behind me, and I remember backing up slowly, never taking my eyes off the tree line, then turning and walking quickly to my vehicle. I got in, locked the doors, and waited for Mike with the engine running. When Mike finally showed up, I told him what happened. He seemed skeptical, suggesting maybe it was a bear or even another hunter trying to mess with me. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd heard. I tried to put it out of my mind, tried to convince myself it was just a weird forest encounter, the kind of thing that happens sometimes when you spend enough time in the woods. But I couldn't shake it. About a week later, I went back to the same general area. I don't know why, maybe to prove to myself that it was nothing. This time I brought Mike and my sister's boyfriend Kevin, who was visiting from Portland and wanted to get some hunting in. We got there around 2 in the afternoon, figuring we had a good 3 hours of daylight left. We split up, each heading to different sections. I took an area about half a mile from where I'd had the encounter the week before. It was a spot with good visibility, a slight ridge overlooking a small clearing with dense forest beyond it. For the first hour, everything was normal. I was set up against a thick oak, bough across my lap, just watching and waiting. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional bird call or squirrel rustling through the leaves. Then I started hearing something. Not normal forest sounds. These were coming from in front of me, maybe 60 yards ahead, just past the clearing. I can't even describe them properly. Not quite vocalizations, not quite movement sounds. Just wrong somehow. And they seemed to be moving, shifting positions from left to right and back again. I sat completely still, straining my eyes to see anything unusual. That's when I caught movement at the far edge of the clearing, maybe 40 yards ahead of me. It was quick, just a flash of something stepping from the open space into the denser forest. But what I saw made my blood run cold. What moved wasn't a deer or a bear. I saw muscular arms and legs, covered in reddish-brown hair, moving with purpose. It was upright, walking on two legs, but disappeared into the trees before I could see more. I remember my mouth going completely dry, my heart hammering so hard I was sure anything within 50 yards could hear it. Then the trees started moving, not swaying in the wind. There wasn't much of a breeze that day. These were smaller trees, about the diameter of my forearm, being violently shaken, like something powerful was grabbing them and just rattling them. First one tree would shake, then it would stop, and another would start, creating a pattern moving from left to right through the forest ahead of me. This went on for what felt like forever, but was probably closer to 45 minutes. I was frozen in place, torn between wanting to run and needing to see what was happening. Part of me, the stupid, curious part, wanted to get closer, to confirm what I was seeing. Then the rocks started. The first one landed about 30 yards to my left, just a small one, golf ball sized. Then another, a bit larger, maybe 25 yards away. Then a third, this one the size of a softball, landing only 15 yards from where I sat. They were coming from the direction of the moving trees, and they were getting closer. That was enough for me. I wasn't about to stick around to see what happened when whatever was throwing those rocks decided to come closer. I stood up slowly, slung my bow over my shoulder and started backing away, keeping my eyes fixed on the area where I'd seen the movement. As I retreated, I heard a crash louder than before, like something heavy had slammed into a tree trunk. I turned and walked quickly away, trying not to run, but moving as fast as I could while staying quiet. The whole time, I felt like something was watching me, following just out of sight. I made it back to our meeting spot about 45 minutes early. I was the first one there, and I sat in my truck with the doors locked, windows up, engine running, until Mike and Kevin showed up. They both noticed something was wrong. As soon as they saw me, my hands were still shaking and I must have looked pale. I told them what happened, expecting them to laugh it off. But Kevin got real quiet. He asked me specific questions about what I'd seen, the color of the hair, the way it moved, the tree shaking. When I finished, he told me that his uncle, who worked for the Forest Service in Northern California, had a similar experience in the 90s. No one believed him either. Mike was more skeptical, suggesting maybe it was other hunters messing with me, or possibly a bear standing on its hind legs. But he couldn't explain the rock throwing. Bears don't throw rocks. I haven't been back to that specific area since. I still hunt, but I stay in more open areas, places with better visibility, and I never go alone anymore. I've spent countless hours researching what I might have encountered that day. Read stories from others who've had similar experiences in the Pacific Northwest. Some say it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but I don't know. All I know is what I saw and heard, and it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'm familiar with. Sometimes when I'm in the woods now, even in completely different areas, I get this feeling of being watched, like something's just beyond my field of vision, tracking my movements. I've never heard that specific growl again, but I find myself listening for it, almost expecting it every time a twig snaps nearby. I don't have answers about what happened that day, just questions that keep me awake some nights. Whatever was in those woods with me, it was intelligent enough to try to intimidate me, to drive me away from its territory, and it succeeded. There are places in those forests near Chihalis I won't ever go back to, no matter how good the hunting might be. Story 3. I've been guiding hunts in these mountains for 15 years, and nothing has ever shaken me like what happened in November of 2001. I'm not someone who spooks easily. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and all kinds of wildlife situations. But this was different. I've kept quiet about it for years because I didn't want to be labeled as crazy, but I need to get this off my chest. It started as a pretty standard elk hunt. I was guiding a husband and wife who had booked me for a week-long hunt, and my wife Amy came along as well. We'd been working hard for a couple days with no luck, but that's hunting. Sometimes it goes that way. That morning started off really cold, probably in the low 20s. We left our cabin around 4:30 a.m., grabbed some coffee at the only gas station open that early, and drove about an hour to our spot. We hiked in another 45 minutes before first light, moving quietly through the forest, our breath visible in the cold mountain air. Just after sunrise, we spotted a small herd of elk in a meadow below us. I was excited until I got my binoculars on them, all cows, no bulls. The couple only had tags for bulls, so there was no point pursuing them. The wife seemed disappointed, but that's hunting. You take what the mountain gives you. I suggested we head to a ridge point I knew well, where we could glass several basins and hillsides. It was about a mile hike, mostly uphill, but worth it for the visibility. When we reached the point, I set everyone up with good views. The husband took the eastern side, his wife the southern slope, Amy watched the western edge, and I kept scanning the whole area, periodically making cow-elk calls. If you're not familiar with elk hunting, calling is how you try to attract bulls, especially during the rut. Even though we were past the peak rut, bulls will sometimes still respond. I use a simple diaphragm call that mimics a cow-elk's mewing sound. After about an hour of calling with no response, I was getting antsy. It was probably around 9:30 by then. I made a series of 3 calls, spacing them, about a minute apart. And that's when things got weird. From somewhere below us, maybe 300 yards down in a thickly wooded draw, came a sound I can only describe as wrong. It was low and deep, almost like a growl, but not quite. At first, I thought it might be a bull responding with a quiet chuckle. Bulls sometimes make this throaty sound, but as soon as I heard it, the hair on my arms stood up. "What was that?" Amy whispered. "Not sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe a bull." I waited a few minutes and called again. The response came faster this time. That same deep, resonant sound. It wasn't an elk. It wasn't a bear. It was too deep, too deliberate. Bears make huffing sounds when alarmed, but this was different, more controlled, almost like it was mimicking my call, but couldn't quite get the pitch right. The couple looked at me questioningly. "Probably just a bull," I said, not wanting to alarm them. But Amy knew me too well and could see I was concerned. "I'm going to check it out," I told them. "You all stay here and keep glassing. If you see anything, use the radio." I handed Amy my rifle, keeping only my sidearm, figuring I'd move quieter without the extra weight. As I descended the hillside toward where the sound had come from, I felt increasingly uneasy. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no squirrels chattering. Usually, there's background noise in the woods, but it felt like everything was holding its breath. The area was thick with lodgepole pines and some aspen groves, with lots of deadfall making navigation tricky. I moved as silently as possible, stopping frequently to listen and look. When I reached approximately where the sound had come from, I found nothing. No elk, no deer, no bear, nothing. I'm an experienced tracker, and there should have been some sign, tracks, droppings, browsed vegetation, something, but the ground showed no recent disturbance. I circled the area, maybe 75 yards in each direction, and found nothing that would explain the sound. The silence was getting to me. Usually when you bump an animal, you hear it moving away, but there was nothing, just that heavy silence. I felt watched, not in some vague way, but specifically, like something was tracking my movements. I've spent my life in these mountains and never felt that sensation before. After about 20 minutes of searching, I gave up and headed back to the group. I didn't say much when I returned, just that I hadn't found anything, and suggested we move to a different location. I knew a place about 2 miles away where elk often bed down during midday. We reached the new spot around 11:30 and got set up. It was a small meadow, surrounded by thick forest with good sight lines. I positioned the hunters in natural blinds at the edge of the clearing, then Amy and I moved about 50 yards uphill for a better vantage point. I started calling again, but half-heartedly. I couldn't shake the uneasiness from earlier. Amy noticed and squeezed my arm, giving me a questioning look. I just shook my head slightly. I didn't want to discuss it within earshot of our clients. About 45 minutes later, it happened. From the direction we'd come from, maybe half a mile back, came a sound that I can only describe as rocks being deliberately struck together. Not the random clatter of rocks falling, but a purposeful sound, like someone picking up a good-sized rock and throwing it against another rock or a tree trunk. Clack. Pause. Clack, clack. Amy's eyes went wide. "Gabriel, what is that?" Before I could answer, we heard it again. Clack, clack, clack. The husband turned toward us, clearly having heard it too. "Is someone else hunting up here?" he whispered loudly. I shook my head. We were miles from any trail, and I knew nobody else had a permit for this area right now. Besides, no hunter would make that kind of noise. We sat frozen for several minutes, listening. The sounds came. Again, but from a slightly different direction, as if whatever was making them had moved. I made a decision. "Pack up," I told everyone quietly. "We're moving out." The wife looked confused. "But we just got here?" "Trust me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This area isn't going to produce today. Let's try somewhere else." As we gathered our gear, I noticed Amy staring intently into the forest behind us. "What?" I whispered. "I thought I saw something move," she said. "Just for a second. Something big." We hiked out faster than we'd come in, taking a different route that would loop us back to our vehicle. The couple were clearly confused by my sudden change in plans, but thankfully didn't argue. All the while I kept glancing back, unable to shake the feeling we were being followed. We didn't hear any more rock clacking, but twice I caught a whiff of something pungent, like wet dog combined with something rotten. Anyone who's hunted knows animal smells, but this was different, more concentrated. By the time we reached the truck, it was mid-afternoon. I made up some excuse about checking a different area before dark, but really, I just wanted to get away from there. We drove to another location about 10 miles away and did some half-hearted glassing until dusk, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. That night at the cabin, after the couple had gone to bed, Amy confronted me. "What happened out there today? I've never seen you like that." I told her about the strange sound I'd heard, how nothing had been there when I checked, and how wrong it all felt. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Do you think it was a person? Maybe someone messing with hunters?" I shook my head. We were miles from anywhere, and that sound, it wasn't human. "Bear," she suggested. "No bear makes rocks clack together like that," and there were no tracks. We both fell silent, not wanting to say what we were thinking. It snowed about 2 inches that night. In the morning, I told the couple I wanted to check a new area, but I had a different plan. I needed to go back to see if I could find any evidence in the fresh snow. I dropped Amy and the clients at an easily accessible meadow where they could glass safely, promising to be back in a few hours. I returned to where we'd heard the rock clacking. The fresh snow made navigation tricky, but I knew these mountains well. What I found still haunts me. About a quarter-mile from where we'd been set up, I discovered a dead cow elk. This wasn't unusual by itself. Elk die from various causes, but the way it was killed was all wrong. The chest cavity had been opened, but not like a predator would do it. It was almost surgical. No excessive tearing or bite marks. The rest of the body was largely intact, with minimal feeding. No bear or mountain lion kills like this. What really shook me were the tracks. The snow had begun melting where the sun hit it, distorting them somewhat, but there was no mistaking their size. They were enormous, far larger than any elk, bear, or human prints I'd ever seen. They sank deep into the snow, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The tracks followed a meandering path through the trees, eventually disappearing where the snow thinned under the dense canopy. I took some photos with the disposable camera I kept in my pack, though I doubted they'd show much detail. I didn't stay long. Something felt deeply wrong about being there alone. I returned to the group, said nothing about what I'd found, and finished out the hunt as professionally as I could. The couple never got their bull elk, but at that point, I just wanted the hunt to end without incident. For weeks afterward, I debated reporting what I'd found to the Forest Service or Game and Fish. In the end, I decided against it. The photos didn't turn out well, just blurry impressions in melting snow. Without concrete evidence, I'd sound like another crazy person seeing Bigfoot. But that's exactly what I believe we encountered. Nothing else makes sense. The sounds, the deliberate rock clacking, which I later learned is associated with Sasquatch encounters, the massive tracks, the strangely killed elk, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. It all fits. I've returned to those mountains hundreds of times since then, but never experienced anything similar. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. But then I remember Amy's face when she heard those rocks clacking, and I know it was real. I don't guide hunts in that specific area anymore. I tell clients it's overhunted or the elk patterns have changed. The truth is, I can't bring myself to go back there. Some places in the wilderness should be left alone, and whatever lives in those woods clearly wants to be left in peace. Story 4. I've been hesitant to share this for years because I know how it sounds. I'm not some attention seeker or someone who believes every conspiracy theory out there. Before July 2nd, 2010, I was actually pretty skeptical about the whole Bigfoot thing. Sure, I found it interesting, but I wasn't convinced these creatures actually existed. That changed in one night. It started when my buddies Tom and Kyle were over at my place. We were having a few beers and somehow got on the topic of cryptids and unexplained phenomena. Kyle mentioned he'd been reading about a cluster of Sasquatch sightings near Westport, Ontario, just a couple hours from where we lived. We should check it out, he said, half joking. But the more we talked about it, the more interested we became. I'd been researching this stuff casually for years, and I knew that the area around Westport had a history of weird sightings going back decades. The reports described similar details: massive humanoid figures moving through the trees, strange vocalizations at night, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. What if we actually went there, I suggested, not expecting to find anything, but just to see the area for ourselves? Tom was immediately on board, and Kyle, who had brought it up in the first place, couldn't back out now. We agreed to drive up the next evening. Looking back, I wish we'd never made that decision. We spent the next day researching the specific locations of sightings and reading eyewitness accounts online. I found a forum where hunters and hikers shared their experiences, with several mentioning a particular area near a small lake surrounded by dense forest. One account described hearing tree knocks. Apparently Sasquatches communicate by hitting trees with sticks or rocks. I'd read about this before, but always thought it was bullshit. Still, we decided we'd try it ourselves. We packed some basic gear: flashlights, my good camera with night vision capability, some snacks, and a solid wooden baseball bat. For the tree knocks, not for protection, or at least that's what we told ourselves. We left around 4 in the afternoon, arriving in Westport just as the sun was starting to set. The main road through Westport is picturesque during the day, but as dusk fell, the small town took on an eerie quality. We followed our GPS to the outskirts where the reported sightings had occurred. The paved road eventually gave way to a dirt track that led deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker on either side, forming a dark tunnel. My car's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. "This is definitely horror movie territory," Tom said from the back seat, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. About a kilometer down the dirt road, I pulled over and parked about 100 meters from the main road. The forest was completely silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the light breeze. We got out, grabbed our gear, and stood for a moment, just taking in our surroundings. The forest was dense and dark, with tall pines and thick underbrush. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of moss and decaying leaves. In the distance, I could just make out the glimmer of water, the lake mentioned in the reports. "So, what's the plan?" Kyle asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Let's head toward the lake," I suggested. "That's where most of the sightings have been reported, and we can try those tree knocks once we get deeper in." We followed a barely visible trail that wound through the trees toward the lake. The light was fading fast, and soon we had to turn on our flashlights. The beams cut through the darkness, creating long shadows that seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them. After walking for about 15 minutes, we found a small clearing that gave us a decent view of the lake, while still being sheltered by trees. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. All around us, the forest loomed, thick and impenetrable. "This is a good spot," I said, trying to sound confident. "Let's try those tree knocks." I took the baseball bat from my backpack and looked around for a suitable tree. I selected a thick pine with solid bark and, feeling slightly ridiculous, gave it 3 solid whacks with the bat. The sound echoed through the forest, sharp and distinctive in the silence. We waited, not really expecting anything. 15 seconds passed, then 30, then we heard it. From the direction of the lake came 3 distinct knocks, perfectly mimicking our pattern. The sound was unmistakable, wood on wood, but deeper and more resonant than what I had produced. We froze, looking at each other in disbelief. That could be an echo," Kyle whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. "Let's try again," I said, my heart pounding. I hit the tree twice this time, with a longer pause between knocks. We waited. After about 20 seconds, 2 knocks came back from the same direction. Same rhythm, same pause. "Holy shit," Tom whispered. "Something's answering us." I felt a cold sensation crawl up my spine. This wasn't an echo. Whatever was making that sound was deliberately responding to us. "One more time," I said, my mouth dry. I hit the tree 3 times, with varying pauses between each knock. The response came quicker this time, 3 knocks with the exact same pattern I had used. But then, after a brief pause, we heard something else. 3 more knocks, coming from a completely different direction, deeper in the forest behind us. "There's more than one," Kyle whispered, his face pale in the beam of my flashlight. That's when Tom grabbed my arm. "Guys," he said, his voice barely audible, "I hear something moving." We all went silent, straining to hear. At first I couldn't detect anything, but then I heard it too. Subtle sounds coming from the tree line across from us, maybe 50 meters away. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was more deliberate, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs under something heavy, moving slowly and carefully. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, rumbling growl. It was so deep, it was almost below the threshold of hearing, more felt than heard, like the rumble of distant thunder. But there was no mistaking it for anything natural. "What the fuck was that?" Tom hissed. "We should leave," Kyle said, his voice shaking. "Right now." But before we could move, another sound tore through the night, a scream. It came from the south, a considerable distance away, but it carried clearly through the still air. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Long, slow, and impossibly deep. It started low and rose in pitch before dropping again. Then another scream, similar but slightly different in pattern. Then a third. I've heard coyotes, wolves, foxes, and all manner of forest creatures. This wasn't any of them. It wasn't human either. It was something else entirely. We stood frozen, barely breathing. The forest had gone, completely silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Then the movement in the tree line started again, closer this time. I could hear branches bending, undergrowth being pushed aside. Whatever was out there was big, and it was coming toward us. "Don't run," I whispered, remembering what I'd read about predators. "Back away slowly, toward the car." We began to retreat, step by careful step, keeping our flashlights pointed in the direction of the sounds. The movement continued, paralleling our path but staying just out of sight in the dense trees. Then I saw it, or rather, I saw a shadow move where no shadow should be. Something massive shifted between two trees, momentarily blocking out the faint light from the rising moon. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and broad. I couldn't make out details, just an imposing silhouette that was unmistakably not human, yet moved with an intelligence that was far from animal. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing to do. Whatever was out there, it could move through this forest far faster than we could. For what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes, we experienced a terrifying game of cat and mouse. The tree knock responses continued, sometimes from the lake, sometimes from deeper in the forest. The movement in the tree line persisted, always just at the edge of visibility. The screams came twice more, each time seeming to communicate something to whatever was tracking us. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest where we'd entered. The dirt road and my car were visible about 100 meters away. "We're going to walk, not run, to the car," I whispered. "Stay together." We moved as quickly as we dared, fighting the urge to break into a sprint. Behind us, I could hear movement in the forest keeping pace. Just as we reached the car, I heard one final sound. 3 distinct knocks, much closer than before, followed by what I can only describe as a deep, rumbling exhale. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As we pulled away, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of something large moving at the forest's edge before the darkness swallowed it up. The drive home was silent. None of us knew what to say. What do you say after experiencing something that shouldn't exist? In the days that followed, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was other people playing tricks on us. Maybe it was a combination of known animals and our overactive imaginations. But deep down, I knew better. What we experienced that night was real, and it wasn't anything science has officially recognized. I've never gone back to those woods, and I never will. Sometimes at night, I still hear those screams in my dreams, and I wake up with the unshakable feeling that something is watching me from just beyond my window. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but most think I'm either lying or was somehow mistaken about what I saw and heard. But I know what happened that night. There are things in this world that exist, whether we acknowledge them or not. Things that have been here long before us and will remain long after we're gone. Things that prefer to stay hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. And sometimes, if you're not careful, they answer when you knock. Story 5. I don't usually share this story because people either think I'm making it up or trying to convince myself I saw something more interesting than a bear. But it's been 20 years now, and I still remember every detail like it happened yesterday. I know what I saw. My friend saw it too. And it wasn't a bear. This happened when I was 15. My buddy Jake and I were hardcore into fishing that summer. We'd spend every weekend we could hiking into Cherokee National Forest to fish for trout at Rock Creek. Our parents were cool with it, as long as we took the two-way radios. This was before everyone had cell phones, and promised to be back before dark. That particular day in mid-July was hot, but not unbearable. We'd gotten an early start, leaving around 6 in the morning to beat the worst of the heat. Jake's dad dropped us off at the trailhead with our fishing gear, backpacks with sandwiches and water, and we were off. We were planning to hike about 4 miles into this spot where the creek widened a bit. The trout there were amazing. We'd caught some real beauties there before. The trail followed the river for most of the way, sometimes right alongside it, sometimes climbing up 20 or 30 feet above it. We were chatting about normal teenage stuff, video games, girls from school, complaining about summer reading assignments. It was around 8:30 in the morning, and we'd been hiking for maybe an hour and a half. I remember the moment everything changed so clearly. We were on a relatively straight section of trail where it ran maybe 15 feet above the river. There were pine trees on our right, the drop-off to the river on our left. The ground was mostly rocky with patches of dirt and pine needles. The trail ahead was visible for a good stretch, maybe 100 meters or so. I was mid-sentence talking about something stupid when I saw movement ahead. At first, I just registered that something was crossing the trail from right to left, from the trees toward the river. My brain automatically thought deer for a split second, but then I realized it was way too big for a deer. "Holy shit," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. "Look at that." We both froze. The thing was maybe 50 meters ahead of us, and we had a completely unobstructed view for what must have been 5 to 10 seconds as it crossed the path. It was massive, easily over 300 pounds, probably closer to 400. It was moving, on all fours, which is why my next thought was bear. But even as I thought it, I knew that wasn't right either. The way it moved was all wrong for a bear. Bears have this lumbering gait, kind of rocking side to side. This thing moved fluidly, almost gracefully despite its size. And the proportions were strange. The front limbs seemed longer than a bear's would be. Its back didn't have that distinctive hump that black bears have. But the most striking thing, the detail that's burned into my memory, was the color. It was almost completely white. Not snow white, more like a cream or off-white color. It had long, uneven hair that hung from its body in dirty-looking tufts, swaying as it moved. Some patches looked matted or tangled. I couldn't clearly see its face from that distance, but the head shape seemed more angular than a bear's. Less round, more, I don't know, elongated maybe. It disappeared into the trees on the left side of the trail, presumably heading down toward the river. For a few seconds, Jake and I just stood there completely still. I remember my heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. "Did you see that?" I finally whispered, still staring at the spot where it had crossed. "Yeah," Jake said. His voice sounded strange, higher than normal. "What the fuck was that?" "I don't know. A bear, maybe?" Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't right. "Dude, bears aren't white, and it didn't move like a bear." We stood there debating for another minute or two. Jake thought maybe it was some kind of huge albino wolf, but I knew it was way too big for that. I suggested maybe it was someone's escaped exotic pet, like a polar bear or something, which sounds ridiculous now. We were just trying to make sense of what we'd seen. After our initial shock wore off, curiosity took over. We cautiously continued down the trail to where the creature had crossed. The ground there was mostly rocks, with some patches of dirt and pine needles. We looked for tracks, but couldn't find anything clear. The dirt patches showed some disturbance, but nothing we could identify as a definite footprint. Whatever it was had moved across mostly rocky ground where it wouldn't leave tracks. We searched the area for about 15 minutes, even going a little way down toward the river where we thought it might have gone, but we didn't see any sign of it. No broken branches, no hair caught on anything, no tracks where the ground got softer near the water. "Should we keep going or head back?" Jake asked. I could tell he was nervous, and honestly, so was I. But we were 15-year-old boys, and the thought of telling everyone we'd chickened out and gone home without fishing was worse than our fear of whatever we'd seen. Plus, we rationalized that it had been moving away from where we were headed. "Let's keep going," I said. "But maybe we should stick closer together." For the rest of the hike, we were hyper-aware of our surroundings. Every snapped twig or rustling bush made us jump. We talked in low voices and kept scanning the forest around us. The familiar trail suddenly felt alien and threatening. We made it to our fishing spot about 45 minutes later. It was a beautiful section where the creek widened into a small pool before narrowing again. Normally, we'd immediately set up our gear and get fishing, but that day, we spent the first 20 minutes just looking around, making sure we were alone. Eventually, we started fishing, but our hearts weren't in it. We kept looking over our shoulders and jumping at sounds. Even when Jake caught a decent-sized trout, our celebration was subdued. Around noon, we mutually decided to pack up and head back, much earlier than we'd planned. The hike back was tense. We barely talked, just moved as quickly as we could without running. Every time we approached a bend in the trail, my stomach would knot up with the fear that the white creature might be around the corner. We made it back to the trailhead, without incident, and called Jake's dad on the radio to come get us early. On the ride home, Jake's dad asked why we'd cut the trip short. We looked at each other, and I could see Jake was thinking the same thing I was, that his dad wouldn't believe us. "Just got too hot," Jake said. His dad accepted this without question. Later that night, Jake called me. "I keep thinking about what we saw," he said. "I've been looking online, but I can't find anything that matches it." "Me too," I admitted. "I asked my dad if there are white bears, and he laughed and said only polar bears, and those definitely aren't in Tennessee." We promised each other we'd go to the library the next day to research. This was 2003, so Google existed but wasn't what it is today, and we didn't have great internet at home. The next day at the library, we found nothing about white creatures in the Appalachians, except for some vague mentions of white Bigfoot sightings that the books clearly treated as hoaxes. Over the next few weeks, we told a few friends what we'd seen. Most of them either outright didn't believe us or suggested we'd seen a regular bear that just looked weird in the morning light. My mom thought maybe it was a large feral hog. Apparently some can get very light-colored, but that didn't match what we saw either. We went back to Cherokee National Forest to fish many times after that, but never to that exact spot again. We always chose places accessible by shorter trails or different routes. Neither of us admitted we were avoiding that area, but we both knew that's what we were doing. The strangest part of all this is how clearly I still remember every detail 20 years later. Most memories from when I was 15 have faded or blurred together, but this one remains crystal clear. The way it moved, the dirty white hair hanging in tufts the size of it. Sometimes I convince myself maybe it was just a bear with some kind of condition that affected its color and movement. There's a disease called mange that can make animals lose fur and look strange. But then I remember the way it moved, so smooth and deliberate. And I know that explanation doesn't fit. Jake and I have talked about it a few times over the years. He remembers it exactly as I do, which is significant because we didn't compare notes in detail until days after the sighting. We independently described the same creature. I've researched cryptid sightings in the Appalachians extensively since then. There are some accounts of white Bigfoot-type creatures, though they're rare. Most Bigfoot sightings describe dark brown or black creatures. But there are a handful of reports of white ones, sometimes called ghost Bigfoot by the cryptid community. I don't know if that's what we saw. I can't say for sure it was a Bigfoot or any specific cryptid. All I know is that it was large, whitish, moved in a way no known animal moves, and left no trace. 20 years later, I still sometimes have dreams about it crossing that trail, those dirty white tufts of hair swaying with each fluid step. What bothers me most isn't the fear of what it might have been, but the fact that I'll probably never know. Whatever we saw that day in Cherokee National Forest doesn't exist according to science. Yet I saw it. Jake saw it. It was real, moving through the same world we live in, following its own mysterious existence just out of reach of our understanding. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I've gotten used to the skeptical looks and the "maybe it was just a bear" comments. But I know what I saw. And sometimes when I'm hiking in the woods, even now as a 35-year-old man, I find myself scanning the trail ahead, half expecting to see that cream-colored figure crossing my path once again. Story 6. Matee. I still can't believe what I saw 3 days ago, and I'm struggling to even write this down. My hands are shaking just thinking about it. I'm not some conspiracy theorist or someone who jumps at shadows, I swear. I'm a nurse, for God's sake. I deal with reality every day. I even used to be a pilot, so I'm trained to observe things accurately. But what I saw in the woods behind my cabin, I can't explain it. I live in a pretty remote area near North Branch Lamoille River in Vermont. My cabin sits about 125 meters back from what locals call the Golden Road, just a dirt access road that winds through the forest. I bought this place 2 years ago because I wanted the solitude after working in a busy hospital in Burlington. The nearest neighbor is almost half a mile away, and there's dense forest all around. Usually that's exactly what I love about it. It was last Sunday, around 2 in the afternoon. One of those perfect Vermont summer days. Clear blue sky, about 75 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. I was out on my deck, drinking iced tea and reading. My Chihuahua, Max, was sunbathing nearby. He's tiny, but usually acts like he's a Rottweiler. That day started so normal. I remember the exact moment everything changed. Max suddenly jumped up and started barking, not his normal "someone's coming" bark, but this frantic, high-pitched sound I'd never heard from him before. His whole body was rigid, and he was staring intensely toward the Golden Road. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or a moose. We get them sometimes. I stood up and walked to the railing of my deck and headed down the steps from my deck. Max refused to follow me. He just stayed on the deck whining. That should have been my first clue to turn around. Max isn't afraid of anything. 3 weeks ago, he chased a black bear off my property, barking like a maniac until it scrambled up a tree. But something made me keep going. I guess it was the nurse in me, needing to confirm what I'd seen, to have some kind of evidence. I walked slowly toward where the figure had been, the air horn clutched so tightly in my hand that my knuckles were white. When I reached the spot where I thought I'd seen it walking, I noticed something in the ground. 3 distinct depressions, about a foot apart from each other. They weren't full footprints. The ground was too dry and covered with fine gravel for that, but they were definitely impressions of something heavy. And at the front of each depression were what looked like toe marks, approximately 12 centimeters long. Not human toes, not bare paws, something else. I took a few photos with my phone, but they don't really show much. Just some disturbed gravel that could be anything. I know what I saw, though. As I stood there, I suddenly remembered something that happened the week before. I was in my garden behind the cabin when I heard twigs snapping and seeds rustling in the woods just beyond my property line. At the time, I figured it was a deer or raccoon. Now I'm not so sure. The entire walk back to my cabin, I felt like I was being watched. The forest that had always felt like a sanctuary suddenly seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. When I got back to the deck, Max was still there, trembling and whining. I picked him up, and his little heart was racing so fast I was worried he might have a heart attack. I took him inside, locked all the doors, and closed all the blinds. I didn't go back outside for the rest of the day. That night was the worst. Every creak of the cabin, every sound from the woods had me sitting bolt upright in bed. I barely slept, and when I did, I had nightmares about that figure with the long arms and small head. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after working too many night shifts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt different somehow. I decided to take Max for a walk, sticking to the areas close to the cabin where I felt safe. When we approached the area where I'd seen the figure, Max started trembling again and refused to go any further. This is the same dog who fearlessly confronted a bear 3 times his size. Whatever he sensed, there terrified him. I called the local ranger station that afternoon. The guy I spoke to was nice but dismissive. He said it was probably just a bear walking funny, or maybe a person in dark clothes. He promised to have someone check the area during their regular patrol, but I could tell he wasn't taking me seriously. I've been sleeping with my bedroom door barricaded for the past 3 nights. I've lived in this cabin for 2 years and never once felt afraid until now. I'm considering installing security cameras, but part of me is afraid of what they might capture. Yesterday, I drove into town and asked some of the locals if they'd ever heard stories about strange creatures in the woods. Most of them laughed it off, but one older man got really quiet. He said his grandfather used to talk about shadow people in the forests around North Branch. According to him, they weren't ghosts or aliens, but something that had always been there watching from the trees. He said they usually keep to themselves unless someone ventures too deep into their territory. I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm a rational person. I deal with facts and evidence every day in my job. But I know what I saw wasn't a bear or a person. The way it moved, those impressions in the ground, Max's reaction, it all points to something that shouldn't exist, but does. Last night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up to Max growling at my bedroom window. The blinds were closed, but there was a shadow there, just for a second, like something was standing right outside. By the time I gathered the courage to peek through the blinds, there was nothing there. But on my deck, right where I'd been sitting when this all started, was a small pile of pine cones arranged in a perfect circle. I haven't told anyone else about this because I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw. There's something out there in those woods. Something that walks on 2 legs, but isn't human. Something that's aware of me now. I'm writing this from a hotel in Burlington. I couldn't stay in that cabin another night. I don't know if I'll ever go back. The thing is, I never believed in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. But now I can't stop wondering what else might be out there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching and waiting. Story 7. I've never been a believer in the paranormal or cryptids or any of that stuff. I'm a practical guy who spent most of my life outdoors. I've hunted, fished, and hiked all over Washington state since I was a kid. When friends would talk about Bigfoot, I'd roll my eyes. That was until 2012, during strawberry season in Tucson, near Dayton, Washington. What happened that day changed everything I thought I knew about our forests. I organized a camping trip with some friends and family members, 7 of us total. Most of them were experienced outdoors people, but a couple were first-timers who just wanted to enjoy picking wild strawberries. The plan was simple: camp overnight, spend the day picking berries, then head home with our haul. We drove as far as we could on this old logging road, about 3 miles in, until it dead-ended at the base of a mountain. From there, we hiked up another 1.25 miles to reach this amazing spot I'd found years ago, where wild strawberries grow in abundance. The hike wasn't too difficult, but steep enough that the newcomers were breathing hard by the time we reached our destination. The morning started perfectly. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-70s, slight breeze. Couldn't ask for better conditions. We set up our camp. First, getting tents in place and organizing our gear before heading out to pick berries. Everyone was excited, taking pictures and chatting as we spread out across this mountainside clearing surrounded by dense forest. About 2 hours into picking, I noticed something odd. There was this smell that hit me out of nowhere. Not just any bad smell, this was the most putrid, rank odor I've ever encountered. Like rotting meat mixed with skunk spray and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I looked around at the others, but they were spread out and didn't seem to notice yet. "You guys smell that?" I called out. A couple heads popped up from the berry patches, noses wrinkling as they caught it too. "What the hell is that?" my brother-in-law asked, standing up straight. "Maybe something died nearby," my friend Jess suggested, but I'd smelled plenty of dead animals in my years outdoors. This was different, more concentrated, more deliberate somehow. We tried to ignore it and kept picking. The smell came and went with the breeze, sometimes so strong I had to breathe through my mouth, other times disappearing completely. That's when the first sound happened. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. The sound of two rocks being struck together, not a rock falling and hitting the ground, but deliberately struck, like someone using one rock to hit another. Clack, clear as day. Everyone froze. We all heard it. I scanned the tree line about 50 yards away, but saw nothing. The forest was dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That alone was unnerving. "Probably just a rock falling," I said, trying to sound casual. But I didn't believe that. There was something deliberate about that sound. We went back to picking, but nobody was talking anymore. Everyone was on edge, heads coming up at every little noise. Then it happened again. Clack, and again. Clack. 3 distinct strikes, evenly spaced like a signal. The hair on my arms stood straight up. I've been in the presence of bears, cougars, all kinds of wildlife, and never felt what I felt in that moment. Pure, instinctual fear. "Marcus," my cousin whispered, "what is that?" "I don't know," I answered honestly, my mouth suddenly dry. We stood in a loose circle now, berry buckets forgotten at our feet, all of us facing outward toward the surrounding forest. That's when the worst part happened. The sound started at the base of the hill, maybe 200 yards below us. Something was moving uphill fast, too fast for a human, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I could hear the impact as it displaced rocks and vegetation, a sound like heavy footfalls, but more powerful. The closest thing I can compare it to is the sound of a train braking, this mechanical grinding momentum. Whatever it was big, and it was coming straight toward us. "Go," I said, my voice barely audible at first, then louder. "Go! Uphill, now!" Nobody needed to be told twice. We all bolted, abandoning everything except what was already in our hands. I remember Jenny stumbling, and I grabbed her arm to keep her upright as we scrambled upward toward our camp. The thing behind us was still coming, still making that awful sound as it pushed through the forest, snapping branches and dislodging small boulders that tumbled down the slope. I swear I could feel the ground vibrating. We reached camp in record time, all of us breathing hard, faces pale. We huddled together, listening. The sounds had stopped. Whatever had been charging up the mountain had either stopped or changed direction. "What the hell was that?" Alex kept repeating, his voice higher than normal. "We need to leave," Jenny said, already grabbing her backpack. But I knew better. It's already mid-afternoon. We'd never make it back to the cars before dark. And I don't want to be on this mountain in the dark with whatever that is out there. The group reluctantly agreed. We spent the next hour fortifying our camp as best we could, gathering firewood, making sure everything was secure. Nobody wandered off alone. Nobody even went to pee without a buddy standing guard. As dusk approached, we built the biggest fire I've ever made while camping. Normally I'm conscious about forest fire risks, but that night I wanted as much light and heat as possible. We sat in silence mostly, jumping at every noise from the surrounding woods. The sounds never came back, but throughout the evening, that smell would drift through camp periodically, that unmistakable putrid stench, sometimes stronger, sometimes fainter, but always there, circling us. None of us slept much. We took watches in pairs, keeping the fire going all night. I remember sitting with my back against a tree trunk around 3 in the morning, jumping at every crack of a twig, straining to see beyond the firelight. The forest felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting. When dawn finally broke, we were all exhausted but alive. No one had been hurt, nothing had approached camp, at least not that we could see, but something had definitely been there. The entire campsite reeked of concentrated urine, not human urine, something much more pungent and ammonia-rich. It was everywhere, like the perimeter of our camp had been deliberately marked. The smell was so strong it made us gag as we quickly packed up. We didn't eat breakfast. We didn't make coffee. We didn't talk much. We just packed and got the hell out of there as fast as possible, practically jogging down the mountain back to our vehicles. It wasn't until we were all safely in our cars that anyone spoke about what had happened. "That wasn't a bear," my brother-in-law said, stating what we all knew. "No," I agreed. "Bears don't knock rocks together. Bears don't circle a camp all night without approaching. Bears don't move like that." "So what was it?" Jenny asked, her voice small. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I still can't, not with any certainty. But I know what it felt like. It felt like we were being hunted, studied, warned. I've spent my life in these mountains. I know every animal that lives in these forests and how they behave. What happened that day doesn't fit anything I've ever encountered. The deliberate rock clacking, the speed and power of that charge uphill, the strategic marking of our camp, it all suggests intelligence, purpose. I never went back to those mountains again. When strawberry season came around the next year, I took everyone to Little Natchez instead, much to everyone's relief. I've never told this story to anyone outside our group, because I know how it sounds. I know what people would think. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods and the birds suddenly go quiet, I find myself scanning the tree line, listening for that distinctive sound of stone striking stone. And I remember the overwhelming stench that filled our camp that night, and I wonder what might have happened if we'd decided to hike out in the dark after all. I used to laugh at Bigfoot stories. I don't anymore. I don't know what was in those woods that day. But it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered in all my years outdoors, and whatever it was, it wanted us to know we were in its territory. I still go camping. I still hunt and fish. But I always bring more people now, always make more noise, and I never, ever ignore when the forest goes silent. Because now I know, sometimes, there's something out there listening. Story 8. I've debated posting this for years. It's been 20 years since it happened, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I've spent my whole life outdoors, hunting and hiking in some of the most remote parts of the Northwest, but nothing has ever shaken me like what happened on April 20th, 2003. My buddy Mark and I were heading out to check on a bear bait site we'd set up near the Idaho-Montana border. It was a beautiful spring day, cool but clear, perfect hiking weather. The area is strictly foot travel only, no ATVs or vehicles allowed, which is why we liked it. You rarely ran into other people there. We parked at the trailhead around 8 in the morning. The hike to our bait barrel was about 2 miles in, following an old logging trail that ran along a mountain slope, maybe 30 feet above a creek that flowed through the drainage. We'd been using this site for a couple seasons and knew the area well. About a mile into our hike, Mark stopped suddenly. Right in the middle of the trail was a dead muskrat. Now, finding dead animals in the woods isn't unusual, but this was different. The muskrat looked completely fresh, like it had died minutes ago. No blood, no visible trauma. It was just there. "That's weird," Mark said, poking it with a stick. "No predator marks." I bent down to look closer. The animal wasn't torn up or partially eaten. There were no tracks around it, no signs of predators or scavengers. It was as if someone had just placed it there. "Maybe it fell from a bird," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. The animal was intact, with no talon marks. Mark shrugged and we continued hiking, but something about that muskrat bothered me. It felt deliberate, placed. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling uneasy. When we reached our bait barrel another mile up the trail, things got even stranger. We'd left bait, a mixture of dog food, molasses and some old donuts, the week before, hoping to draw in bears for the upcoming season. The bait had clearly been touched. Some of it was gone. But there were no bear signs, no claw marks on the trees, no tracks in the soft ground around the barrel, no hair caught on the rough bark where bears typically rub. "This doesn't make sense," I said, examining the area. "Something's been at the bait, but I'm not seeing any bear sign." Mark nodded, looking confused. "Maybe raccoons, though they usually leave tracks." We refilled the bait barrel and sat down on some fallen logs to rest and have some water. It was around 10:30 by then, and the forest was oddly quiet. No birds, no squirrels chattering. I remember thinking how still everything felt. That's when we heard it, the distinct sound of branches breaking on the slope above us. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably a deer or elk moving through the timber. But then there was a louder crack, followed by a chunk of tree bark tumbling down the slope toward us. Mark and I both looked up at the same time. The slope above us was steep, covered in ponderosa pines and granite outcroppings. About 400 yards up, on a rocky ledge, I saw something that stopped my breath. At first glance, I thought it was a moose. It was the same dark brown color. But moose don't stand upright on two legs. This thing was standing like a human, perfectly balanced on the rocky ledge. One of its arms, and I say arm because it definitely wasn't a front leg, was resting against a tree trunk that had been snapped about halfway up. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Mark, not taking my eyes off the figure. Mark didn't answer. I glanced over and saw his face had gone completely pale. I looked back up at the creature. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders and a massive upper body. Its legs seemed almost too thin for its heavy torso, but it stood perfectly balanced on the uneven ground. What struck me most was its head, or rather, the lack of a distinct neck. The head seemed to blend right into those massive shoulders, and it was tilted downward, as if it was watching us. Even from that distance, I could feel it observing us. Not like an animal watches, curious or fearful, but with intelligence, purpose. I'm a hunter. I know what it feels like to be the one doing the watching. This was different. I was being studied. Before I could say anything else, Mark turned and started walking quickly, back toward the trail. He didn't run, which was smart since running can trigger predator instincts, but his pace made it clear he wanted out of there. I took one more look up at the ledge. As I watched, the creature calmly stepped behind the broken tree and vanished into the timber. No rushing, no crashing through the brush. It moved with a silence that was impossible for something that size. I caught up with Mark, who was already 20 yards down the trail. "Did you see that thing?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't want to talk about it right now," he said. "Let's just get back to the truck." The 2-mile hike back felt like 10. Every step of the way, I had this overwhelming sensation of being watched, followed. Not from behind us, but from the hillside above. Like whatever that thing was, it was pacing us, staying just out of sight in the timber. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you and you can just sense it? Multiply that by 100. There was a pressure in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I kept looking up at the slope, expecting to see it watching us again, but there was nothing visible. When we passed the spot where we'd found the muskrat earlier, it was gone. Not a trace of it remained. No drag marks, no blood, nothing to indicate it had ever been there. We made it back to the truck around noon, and neither of us spoke much on the drive home. Mark finally broke the silence about halfway back. "That wasn't a bear," he said flatly. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. It wasn't a person either." I nodded. We both knew what we'd seen defied explanation. It moved too naturally on 2 legs to be a bear, but was too large and proportionally wrong to be a human in a suit or anything like that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those broad shoulders, that necklace head tilted down toward us, and I remembered something I'd completely forgotten until then. The previous year, during deer season, I'd been hunting alone, in that same drainage, I'd heard the strangest vocalizations echoing through the forest. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, definitely not an elk bugle or wolf call. It was a sound I couldn't place, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. I'd written it off at the time, told myself it was just the wind or some animal I wasn't familiar with. Now I wonder if it was connected to what we saw. Mark and I never went back to that bait site. We made excuses. It was too far to hike. There were better spots closer to road access, but the truth is, neither of us wanted to go back there. I haven't spoken to Mark in years, but I bet he still thinks about that day too. I've spent 2 decades trying to rationalize what we saw. I've looked up every large animal native to the Idaho-Montana border region. I've researched obscure wildlife, rare bears, even escaped exotic pets. Nothing matches what we encountered. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has seen it too. If anyone else has felt that same sensation of being the prey rather than the predator, of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. I still hunt and hike. I refuse to let one unexplainable experience rob me of something I love, but I never go into the woods alone anymore. And I never, ever ignore that gut feeling when something doesn't seem right, like finding a perfectly intact dead animal placed in the middle of a trail. The woods have always been my sanctuary, the place where I feel most at peace. But since that day in 2003, I've carried the knowledge that there are things out there we can't explain. Things that watch from rocky ledges with 2 broad shoulders and heads that melt into their torsos. Things that can move silently through dense timber despite their size. Things that remind us that for all our guns and gear and experience, we're not at the top of the food chain. Not really, not always. To this day, I can't explain what we saw on that mountain slope. All I know is that for a brief moment, the hunter became the hunted, and I never want to feel that way again. Story 9. I've been debating whether to post this for months. I'm still not sure if writing it down will help or just make the nightmares worse, but I need to tell someone who might understand what happened to us that night in Riverview Woods. This happened last October when my buddy Chad and I decided to go camping. We're both experienced outdoorsmen. I've been hunting since I was 12, and Chad spent 3 years as a wilderness guide up in Maine. We planned a weekend trip deep into Riverview Woods, a massive forest preserve about 40 minutes from where we live. It's not exactly a tourist spot. Mostly locals know about it, and there are only a few marked trails near the entrance. The interior is pretty much untouched. We packed our usual gear: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, the basics. Chad brought his .45 black powder pistol, and I had my trusty .22 rifle. Nothing crazy, just enough protection in case we ran into an aggressive animal. In all my years camping, I've never had to fire a warning shot, but better safe than sorry. We drove out early Saturday morning, parked at the small lot near the trailhead, and hiked in. The plan was to go deep, way off any established trails. We wanted solitude, you know. After about 4 hours of hiking, we found this perfect little clearing near a small stream. Must have been at least 5 miles from the nearest trail. We spent the afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, and clearing a roughly 10 by 10 foot area for our tents. We weren't being quiet about it either, talking, laughing, making plenty of noise to scare off any wildlife. That's camping 101. Make noise so you don't surprise anything with teeth or claws. By early evening, we had a decent fire going. The temperature was dropping fast, typical October weather, probably in the low 40s. We cooked some hot dogs, drank a few beers, and swapped the same old hunting stories we always tell. Normal camping stuff. It was getting dark, maybe around 8:45, when I first noticed something wasn't right. We were sitting by the fire, and Chad was in the middle of some story about his ex-girlfriend when I heard it. Movement in the brush, maybe 30 yards out. Not the random rustling of a squirrel or rabbit. This was deliberate, methodical. Something large moving slowly through the underbrush. "You hear that?" I asked Chad, cutting him off mid-sentence. He stopped talking and listened. After a few seconds, he nodded. "Probably a deer," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Whatever it wasn't moving like a deer. Deer tend to move, stop, listen, then move again. This thing was moving steadily, circling our campsite at a consistent distance. And it wasn't trying to be quiet. It was like it wanted us to know it was there. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but the beam only penetrated about 15 feet into the darkness. The woods were too thick, too dark beyond our little circle of firelight. "Should we fire a warning shot?" Chad suggested, reaching for his .45. I shook my head. "Let's wait. Could just be a curious black bear." That's when the smell hit us. It was unlike anything I've ever encountered in the woods, something between rotting garbage and cheap musk cologne, powerful enough to reach us over the campfire smoke. Not bear, not coyote, not anything I recognized. "What the hell is that smell?" Chad whispered, his face scrunching up. I didn't answer because I didn't have one. My mind was racing through every animal I knew lived in those woods, and none of them matched what I was experiencing. For the next hour, the thing continued circling us, never coming closer than about 30 yards, never moving further than maybe 50. Just circling, watching. The sound of branches breaking and leaves crunching under. Heavy weight circled our camp. Occasionally, there would be a deeper sound, like something large brushing against a tree trunk. Chad was getting visibly nervous, which was unusual for him. He's normally the level-headed one. "If this keeps up, we should pack it in," he said quietly. "I don't like this." I nodded, but pointed out that hiking through unfamiliar woods at night wasn't exactly safe either. Better to wait until morning, I thought. Around 10:30, Chad realized his .45 wasn't by his backpack where he'd left it. He remembered cleaning it earlier, near the edge of our clearing. "It's over there," he said, pointing to a spot about 10 feet from our fire, right in the direction where we'd been hearing the movement. "I'll cover you," I said, picking up my .22. Chad nodded and slowly walked toward his pistol, which was barely visible in the firelight. I kept my rifle trained on the darkness beyond him, my finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. As Chad bent down to grab his gun, there was a sudden, violent rustling from the woods, much closer now, maybe 15 yards away. Chad froze, then slowly picked up his .45 and backed toward the fire. "Hey!" he shouted toward the sound. "We're armed! Back off!" The movement stopped for maybe 20 seconds. Complete silence. Then it started again, circling, but now it was closer, maybe 20 yards away. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. Every instinct was screaming that something was very wrong. "What do we do?" Chad whispered, checking to make sure his pistol was loaded. "Keep the fire going," I said. "Whatever it is, it's staying back because of the light." We fed more wood into the fire, building it higher. For a while, that seemed to work. The presence backed off to about 75 yards, still circling, but at a more comfortable distance. We could still hear it moving, still catch whiffs of that horrible smell when the wind shifted, but it wasn't as immediate. Around midnight, Chad started talking about putting the fire out and trying to get some sleep. We were both exhausted from the hike and the tension. "Maybe it'll be gone by morning," he said, not sounding convinced. He had just started kicking dirt onto one side of the fire when everything changed. The thing charged. There's no other way to describe it. 1 second it was circling at a distance. The next it was crashing through the underbrush directly toward our camp. Not trying to be stealthy anymore. This was a full-on rush. Branches snapped, bushes were crushed, and there was a sound like heavy footfalls hitting the ground in rapid succession. "Jesus Christ!" Chad yelled, raising his .45. I had my .22 up as well, both of us pointing wildly into the darkness, trying to find a target. The charging sound stopped right at the edge of our clearing, just outside the firelight. We couldn't see it, but we could hear it breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing, not the panting of a winded animal. This was controlled, deliberate, like it had sprinted toward us but wasn't even tired. "Don't move," I whispered to Chad, who was trembling visibly now, his gun hand shaking. "Don't run, that's what it wants." I don't know why I said that. It just felt true in that moment, that whatever this thing was, it was trying to panic us, to make us flee. "Get down," I hissed, pulling Chad's arm until he crouched beside me. "Low profile, don't show your silhouette against the fire." We stayed that way for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The breathing continued from the edge of the clearing. Occasionally, there would be a subtle shift in position, twigs cracking as it moved slightly to one side or the other. It was watching us, studying us. "We need to get out of here," Chad whispered, so quietly I barely heard him. "Now." I nodded. Our tents, most of our gear, that could all be replaced. Slowly, painfully slowly, we began crawling backward, away from the thing, and toward the opposite edge of the clearing. Every few feet we'd stop and listen. The breathing would adjust, moving slightly to track our progress. It knew exactly where we were. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of it through the dying firelight. Just for a second as it shifted position. Tall, much taller than me, and I'm 6'1", extremely wide shoulders. Bipedal. That's all I could make out for certain. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I recognized. We abandoned stealth and scrambled to our feet, plunging into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing. No flashlights. We were too afraid to turn them on and give away our position. Just running blindly through the trees, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Behind us, I heard it enter our campsite. There was the sound of fabric tearing, probably our tents, and then it was following us. Not charging now, but walking steadily, following our exact path, step for step. We ran for what felt like miles, tripping over roots, getting slapped in the face by branches we couldn't see in the dark. All the while, that thing followed, never more than 50 yards behind us, never gaining, never falling behind, just escorting us out of its territory. As we got closer to the main trail, maybe a mile from the parking lot, it finally started to lag behind. The footsteps grew more distant, and the awful smell faded. By the time we reached the parking lot, we couldn't hear it anymore. We drove home in complete silence. What could we even say? We left thousands of dollars worth of camping gear in those woods, never went back for it, never reported what happened because who would believe us? I've been back to Riverview Woods since then, but never past the main trails. Sometimes when I'm there, I swear I catch a whiff of that same smell, like rotting garbage and musk, just at the edge of my perception. Chad moved to Arizona last month. Said he needed somewhere with less trees. I understand. I still don't know what followed us that night. All I know is that it was intelligent enough to intimidate us, territorial enough to escort us out, and deliberate enough to let us leave once we were heading in the right direction. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there in Riverview Woods, circling some other campsite, watching, waiting for someone else to wander too deep into its domain. Story 10. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night back in '95. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear those sounds again, even though I'm hundreds of miles away now. I've never talked about this outside my immediate family and the guys who were there, but I need to get this off my chest. I was 16 that summer, living in Fairfax County, Virginia. Me and my 4 buddies, Mike, my best friend since 3rd grade, Kyle, Derek, and Tyler, we were all into hiking and camping. We weren't hardcore outdoorsmen or anything, just typical suburban kids looking for something to do on weekends besides hanging at the mall or playing video games. It was early August, hot as hell during the day, but nice and cool at night. Perfect camping weather. We'd been planning this trip for a couple weeks, nothing fancy. Just one night at this spot Mike and I had found a month earlier while biking. It was this clearing on a hillside above the Potomac River with a great view of this big island below. You could see for miles, and it was secluded enough that we wouldn't get hassled by park rangers or anything. Our parents were cool with it since we weren't going far from home, maybe 4 miles from my house. We packed light, 2 tents, sleeping bags, a cooler with sodas and sandwiches, some chips and marshmallows for roasting. Kyle brought his dad's old camping lantern, and I had this cheap flashlight from the dollar store. Looking back, we were ridiculously underprepared for what happened. We headed out around 4 in the afternoon, taking our time, goofing around like teenagers do. We got to the spot around 6 and set up camp. It was this beautiful clearing surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides, with the hillside sloping down toward the river on the 4th. We could see the water glimmering through the trees. The island was visible from where we stood, a large, densely wooded mass in the middle of the Potomac. We did normal camping stuff for the first few hours, got a small fire going, roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, told stupid jokes and stories. Tyler had snuck a couple beers from his dad's fridge, so we each had one, feeling like rebels. Nothing crazy, just enough to give us that slight buzz of doing something forbidden. Everything was completely normal until around midnight. Mike and Derek were already half asleep in one tent. Kyle, Tyler and I were still sitting around the dying fire, talking about school starting in a few weeks, and this girl Tyler had a crush on. That's when we heard it. The first scream. I say scream because I don't know what else to call it. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard either. It came from across the river, somewhere on or near that island. It was this long, high-pitched wailing sound that started low and rose to this blood-curdling pitch before tapering off. It echoed across the water, bouncing off the hills around us. We all froze. Tyler whispered, "What the hell was that?" "Probably just a fox," Kyle said, but I could tell by his voice he didn't believe it. I'd heard foxes scream before. They can sound freaky, almost human-like. But this was different. This was louder, more sustained, and had this weird modulation to it, like whatever made it was controlling the sound deliberately. We sat there, perfectly still, just listening. About 2 minutes later, it came again. Same sound, but closer. Definitely closer, like whatever made it had crossed part of the river. Mike poked his head out of the tent. "You guys hear that?" Before any of us could answer, it screamed again. This time, there was an answer. Another scream, similar but different somehow, coming from our side of the river but further down. "That's it, I'm out," Derek said, fully awake now and already rolling up his sleeping bag. "Calm down," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's probably just some animal we've never heard before, or maybe some people messing around." That's when we heard the shuffling. It came from the woods behind us, this slow, deliberate movement through the underbrush. Not like a deer or raccoon, which move quickly and then stop. This was steady, methodical, like something large moving carefully, trying not to make noise but too heavy to be completely silent. Then the drumming started. I swear I'm not making this up. It was this rhythmic tapping or pounding, like someone hitting a log with a stick, but in this specific pattern, 3 quick beats, pause, 2 slow beats, pause, repeat. It came from the woods to our left, maybe 50 yards away. Kyle switched on his lantern and pointed it toward the sound, but the light only reached about 20 feet into the trees. Beyond that was just darkness. "Hey!" Tyler suddenly yelled, standing up. "We know you're out there. This isn't funny." I yanked him back down. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "It's obviously someone trying to scare us," he said, but his voice was shaking. The screaming, the shuffling, and the drumming all stopped at once. The silence that followed was somehow worse. We all sat there, barely breathing, straining to hear anything. After about a minute of this awful silence, Mike whispered, "Maybe they left." That's when the rocks started falling. Not falling, being thrown. The first one was big, maybe the size of a softball, and it crashed through the branches above us and landed just feet from our fire. Then, another hitting one of our tents. Then more, stones and sticks raining down around us from all directions. We lost it. All pretense of bravery gone, we scrambled to grab our backpacks and sleeping bags, abandoning the tents and most of our gear. I remember Kyle trying to fold up his tent and Mike screaming at him to just leave it. The barrage continued as we gathered what we could. A rock hit Derek in the shoulder and he cried out in pain. I grabbed my flashlight and backpack and started running toward the trail, the others right behind me. As we fled, the screaming started again, multiple voices now, calling back and forth, and they were following us, not on the trail, but moving through the woods parallel to us. We could hear branches snapping, undergrowth being pushed aside. Whatever was chasing us wasn't even trying to be quiet anymore. The trail back was mostly downhill, which normally would have made for an easy hike, but in the dark, with just my crappy flashlight and Kyle's lantern, it was treacherous. Tyler tripped and went down hard, scraping his hands and knees. We hauled him up and kept going. The sounds followed us for at least a mile. The screams would come, then stop, then come again, always off to our side, never falling behind. The drumming continued too, somehow keeping pace with us despite how fast we were moving. Finally, we broke out of the woods into a clearing near a residential area. The streetlights were visible about a quarter mile away. As soon as we hit open ground, the sounds stopped. Just stopped. Like whatever was following us wouldn't come out into the clear. We didn't slow down until we reached the street. We were all gasping for breath, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. Derek's shoulder was already bruising where the rock had hit him. Tyler's hands were bloody from his fall. What the actual hell was that? Kyle kept saying over and over. None of us had an answer. We split up there, Kyle, Derek, and Tyler heading to their homes in one direction, while Mike and I went another way, since we lived closer to each other. As Mike and I walked, still too amped up and scared to slow down, he admitted something that chilled me even more. "I heard those screams last weekend," he said quietly. "What? Where?" "From my bedroom. I live right near where we were camping, remember? It was like 3 in the morning. I thought I was dreaming at first, but I got up and looked out the window. Couldn't see anything, but the sounds went on for like 10 minutes. I didn't tell anyone else about what happened, not right away. But 3 days later, I was talking to Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who lived at the edge of our subdivision closest to the woods. Without me bringing it up, she mentioned hearing the strangest animal sounds lately at night. She described them exactly as we'd heard them. That's when things got worse. About 2 weeks after our camping trip, I was up late reading in my room. Our house was about 2 miles from where we'd camped, near a small lake. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it. That same screaming sound coming from the woods behind our house. I froze, book in hand, not even breathing. It called 3 times, then silence. The next night, my dad heard it too, then my mom a few nights later. Within a month, the sounds had become regular enough that we started keeping our windows closed at night, even though it was still warm out. What bothers me most, looking back, isn't just the screams or even being chased through the woods. It's the deliberateness of it all, the coordinated movements, the drumming, the way they herded us out of their territory but followed just far enough to make sure we were really leaving. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just making noise or randomly throwing things. It was communicating, organizing, working together. My family moved to Colorado the following year. My dad got a job offer, and we all pretended that was the only reason for the move. But I know the real reason. None of us could stand those sounds anymore, or the feeling of being watched whenever we went into our backyard. I've researched local legends, cryptids, everything I could find about Fairfax County and the Potomac. There are some Bigfoot sightings reported in Virginia, some stories about strange creatures in the Appalachian Mountains, but nothing that exactly matches what we experienced. I'm 39 now, with kids of my own. I've never been camping since that night. My friends and I don't talk about it when we occasionally catch up. It's like this unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. But sometimes I'll get a text from Mike, who still lives in Virginia, that just says, "Heard anything weird lately?" His way of checking in, of acknowledging without saying it directly. I haven't heard those screams in 23 years, but I still wake up sometimes, heart pounding, thinking I did. And I still wonder what was out there in the woods of Fairfax County, and if it's still there, watching and waiting for someone else to wander into its territory. Story 11. I've been holding this in for over a decade now. September 14th, 2012. That date is burned into my memory because it's the day everything I thought I knew about our forests changed. I'm a professional photographer, mostly landscapes and wildlife. I've spent countless hours in remote areas with my camera, so I'm no stranger to being alone in nature. My fiancée Jen and I decided to hike the Loop Trail near Natural Bridges Viewpoint in Curry County, Oregon. We'd been planning this trip for weeks. The Oregon coast in September is spectacular, fewer tourists, and the light is perfect for photography. I brought my Canon 5D Mark III with a couple of lenses, hoping to catch some dramatic coastal shots for a project I was working on. We arrived around 4 in the afternoon. The weather was typical Pacific Northwest, overcast but not raining yet, temperature in the low 60s. The trail itself isn't particularly challenging, about 3 miles round trip with some moderate elevation changes. What makes it special are the views of the natural stone bridges and arches carved by the ocean. I'd been there twice before in previous years, but wanted to show Jen, who had never seen it. The first hour of our hike was completely normal. We took our time, stopping frequently so I could photograph interesting fungi, nurse logs, and the way light filtered through the dense Sitka spruce canopy. Jen was collecting some interesting rocks and driftwood pieces from the beach section. The trail was empty that day. We hadn't seen another hiker since starting. Around 5:30, something changed. I can't explain it rationally, but I suddenly felt this overwhelming urge to leave. It wasn't just getting late or the weather turning. This was a primal feeling, like an alarm going off in my head. My heart rate picked up for no reason. I remember checking my watch and calculating how long it would take us to get back to the parking lot. "Let's start heading back," I told Jen, trying to sound casual. "I want to make it to the car before it gets dark." She gave me a look. The sun wasn't due to set for at least another hour, but agreed. As we turned around, I noticed how quickly the forest seemed to be darkening under the thickening cloud cover. The dense tree canopy filtered what little daylight remained, creating deep shadows between the trees. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I first heard it, a sharp cracking sound, like a large branch breaking. Not the normal forest sounds I was used to. It came from somewhere off to our right, maybe 50 yards into the trees. Jen heard it too and grabbed my arm. "What was that?" she whispered. "Probably just a fallen branch," I said, but I didn't believe it myself. Something felt off. We picked up our pace without discussing it. Then it happened again, another crack, this time closer. What bothered me most was how deliberate it sounded, not random or natural. It had a rhythm to it, like footsteps. That's when I noticed the bushes moving about 20 yards ahead on the trail. There was no wind, absolutely none, yet these salal bushes were swaying as if something was pushing through them. My first thought was bear or maybe elk, but something didn't fit. The movement pattern was wrong. Then the smell hit us. Jesus Christ, that smell. I've smelled dead animals in the woods before, roadkill on hot days, even a decomposing seal on the beach once. This was different. Sour and rotting like garbage left in the sun for days, mixed with something musky and animal. It was so strong I could taste it. Jen covered her nose with her sleeve. "What is that?" she gagged. I shook my head, not wanting to waste time talking. "Let's just keep moving." The final stretch of the trail includes an uphill section that winds through some of the densest forest before opening up near the parking area. It had started to drizzle, and a mist was forming between the trees, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in places. My camera was tucked safely in my bag now. Photography was the last thing on my mind. We were about halfway up this section when I felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched. Every hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. I've been in the wilderness enough to recognize predator awareness. Something was observing us. I don't know what compelled me to look behind us. I wish I hadn't. Through a gap in the vegetation, partially obscured by mist, I saw it. A large head covered in thick reddish-brown hair was peering at us from behind a cluster of young trees. The head was positioned at least 8 feet off the ground. That detail struck me immediately because I'm 6'1", and this thing was towering over what my height would be. It had a face I can only describe as ape-like, but wrong. The features were similar to a gorilla, but more human in some undefinable way. It had a prominent brow ridge, deep-set eyes that I couldn't make out clearly in the dim light, and no visible neck. The head seemed to sit directly on massive shoulders. The hair was longer than an ape's, almost like a mane around the face, and had a distinctive reddish tint where the little remaining light caught it. The most unsettling part was how it was watching us. Not with aggression or fear, but with obvious curiosity and intelligence. It was studying us. For several seconds, probably only 5 or 6, but it felt like minutes, we locked eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It felt like a standoff, except there was no threat from either side, just mutual shock. Then, deliberately and without rushing, it moved sideways behind a large Sitka spruce and disappeared. The movement was smooth and controlled, not clumsy or panicked. Whatever this thing was, it moved with purpose and familiarity through that forest. I didn't say anything to Jen right away. She was ahead of me on the trail, focused on the increasingly slippery path as the rain picked up. I didn't want to scare her, but more selfishly, I was afraid she'd want to go back and investigate. Every instinct in my body was screaming to get out of there. "Let's pick up the pace," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. "Are you okay?" she asked, turning to look at me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just want to get back before this rain really starts coming down." We practically jogged the rest of the way. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that face again, but there was nothing, just shadows and mist. I could still smell that awful odor lingering in my nostrils, though it had dissipated as we moved away. When we finally reached the parking lot, there were no other cars. We jumped into our rental, and I locked the doors immediately. Only then, as we were pulling away, did I tell Jen what I'd seen. There was something watching us back there, something big. She thought I was joking at first, then saw my expression and realized I was serious. I described it as calmly as I could, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Like a Sasquatch?" she asked, half smiling, but with concern in her eyes. "I don't know what it was," I answered honestly. "I've never believed in any of that stuff, but what I saw wasn't a bear or any animal I recognize." As we drove back to our rental cabin in Brookings, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. I've photographed wildlife for 15 years. I know what bears, elk, and mountain lions look like, even in poor visibility. This was something else entirely. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes watching me through the mist. I considered reporting it, but to who? The park rangers? The local police? What would I say? I saw a Bigfoot. I'd sound insane, plus I had no evidence. Despite being a photographer, I hadn't taken a single picture. In that moment of fear and confusion, reaching for my camera hadn't even crossed my mind. The next morning, with sunlight streaming through our cabin windows, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. A trick of light and shadow, my mind filling in the blanks with something impossible. But then I remembered the smell, the deliberate way it moved, the intelligence in its gaze. Those details were too specific, too vivid to be imagination. We completed our Oregon trip as planned, but I avoided forest trails after that, sticking to open beaches and viewpoints. I made excuses about wanting different photo compositions, but really, I couldn't face going back into those trees. It's been 11 years since that day. I've never told anyone besides Jen what I saw. She believes I saw something unusual, but remains skeptical about what it actually was. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters, looking at blurry photos and videos online, reading witness accounts. Some descriptions match what I saw with eerie accuracy. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the smell. Others seem like obvious hoaxes or misidentifications. I've never gone back to that trail. I've thought about it many times, going prepared with better cameras, maybe trail cams to set up, but something stops me. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's the certainty that whatever was watching us that day doesn't want to be found. And perhaps it's better that way. I still take photos in nature, but something fundamental changed in me that day. The forests I once found peaceful now hold secrets I can't explain. Every unexplained sound makes me freeze. Every shadow between trees catches my attention. I'm constantly aware there might be eyes watching from places we've decided can't possibly hide anything unknown. Sometimes late at night, I still smell that distinctive odor, just for a split second. That rotten, musky scent that has no business being in my suburban home hundreds of miles from the Oregon coast. And I wonder if whatever I saw that day is also remembering our encounter, contemplating the strange, camera-carrying creature it observed on the trail. Story 12. I still get goosebumps typing this out, even though it's been 25 years since it happened. I've debated for years whether to share this experience online, but after seeing other posts about strange encounters in the Colorado mountains, I finally decided it's time. Back in late July of 1998, my husband Mark, our 10-year-old son Jason, and my sister's boy Trevor, who was 13 at the time, went on what was supposed to be a normal backpacking trip in the San Juan Mountains. Mark and I had been hiking these mountains for years. We knew the terrain, the wildlife, everything. We'd been hunting black bears together since the early 80s, so we weren't exactly newbies to the wilderness. We set up our camp near Twin Sisters Peaks, about 4 miles south of Silverton. It was a beautiful spot along this pack trail that follows Lime Creek. The first day went great. Perfect weather, caught some trout for dinner. The boys were having a blast exploring around camp while staying within shouting distance. Nothing unusual. On the second day, Mark wanted to scout for elk hunting spots for the upcoming season. Jason and Trevor wanted to stay back at camp and build a fort they'd started the night before, so Mark and I headed up the mountain alone. We packed light, just water, some granola bars, our binoculars, and a small first aid kit. Mark brought his .44 Magnum too, which was standard for us in bear country. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we reached this ridge about 1.5 miles from camp. The sun was beating down, but there was this nice cool breeze that made it perfect hiking weather. We'd been walking along this game trail that switchbacked up the mountain, talking about mundane stuff, bills, Jason's upcoming school year, whether we should replace our old Chevy. We crested this slope and stopped to catch our breath and have some water. That's when I noticed movement in this clearing across the ridge, maybe 200 yards away. I nudged Mark and pointed. "Bear," I said automatically, because from that distance, that's exactly what it looked like. A large black bear moving along the edge of the clearing. Mark raised his binoculars, and I saw his body language change immediately. His shoulders tensed up, and he froze. Without lowering the binoculars, he handed them to me. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. When I looked through them, my stomach dropped. What I'd thought was a bear on all fours wasn't on all fours at all. This thing was running, full-on sprinting on 2 legs, upright like a human. But it wasn't human. No way. It was huge and black or dark brown all over. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but I could see its arms swinging in perfect rhythm with its stride. "Mark," I said, my voice shaking, "that's not a bear." The way it moved was all wrong. I've seen bears stand up and even take a few awkward steps on their hind legs, but they don't run that way. They can't. And this thing was fast. It was covering ground at maybe 20 miles per hour, which doesn't sound that impressive until you try to picture a person running that fast through mountain terrain. Olympic sprinters on a track barely hit that speed. But the speed wasn't even the weirdest part. It was how smooth its movement was. When humans run, there's this up and down bouncing motion, right? This thing didn't bounce. It was like it was gliding. But with these powerful ground-eating strides, its knees didn't seem to bend the way ours do, and its arms, they weren't flailing like a human's would. They moved with purpose, like they were part of its propulsion system. We called the boys over, who had been collecting rocks about 20 feet behind us. When Trevor got there, he just stared for a second and then said, "I didn't know bears could run on their back legs like that." That confirmed it for me. We were all seeing the same thing. It wasn't just my imagination playing tricks. Mark, who's the most level-headed, practical person I know, the kind of guy who scoffs at ghost stories and thinks Bigfoot is a bunch of nonsense, just kept saying, "That's not right, that's not possible." The creature ran straight across the clearing, never looking in our direction, thank God. Based on the trees it passed, I'd estimate it was around 8 feet tall. Not just tall, but massive. Broad-shouldered with a build that reminded me of those anatomy drawings of early hominids, but bigger and more powerful looking. Then it disappeared into the tree line on the far side of the clearing. We stood there for what felt like forever, not moving, barely breathing. The boys kept asking what it was, and all Mark could say was, "I don't know." After about 5 minutes of stunned silence, Mark finally snapped out of it. "We need to get back to camp," he said quietly. "Now." We practically jogged back down the mountain. Mark kept looking over his shoulder, and I kept the boys in front of me the whole way. Nobody talked much. What was there to say? We'd all seen something that shouldn't exist. When we got back to camp, Mark wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but it was already late afternoon, and we wouldn't make it back to the trailhead before dark. Hiking those trails at night wasn't an option. Too dangerous even without whatever that thing was out there. So we stayed. Mark built the fire up bigger than usual and kept his gun close. None of us slept much. Every snapping twig or rustling bush had us all wide awake. The boys kept asking questions we couldn't answer. Was it a bear? Was it a person in a costume? Are there monsters in these mountains? I've replayed that sighting in my head thousands of times over the years. I've hunted black bears for most of my adult life. I know what they look like in every posture, every type of movement. Whatever we saw that day wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose or an elk or any other animal native to those mountains. The next morning, we packed up at first light and hiked out. Mark wanted to report what we'd seen to the ranger station, but when we got there, he hesitated. What would we say? That we saw a giant bipedal creature running through the mountains. They'd think we were crazy or attention seekers. So we said nothing. We drove home mostly in silence, with just the occasional, "Let's think about this rationally" from Mark, followed by more silence because there was no rational explanation. For weeks afterward, I researched everything I could find about the San Juan Mountains. Native legends, reported sightings of unusual creatures, everything. I found some old mining town newspaper clippings from the 1800s about wild men in those mountains, and more recent reports from hikers describing things similar to what we saw. Mark eventually settled on the explanation that it must have been a bear with some kind of deformity or injury that forced it to run on its hind legs. But I know bears. That wasn't a bear. Trevor had nightmares for months. Jason became obsessed with cryptids and monster stories. Mark and I, well, we just don't talk about it much. What's the point? Nobody would believe us anyway. We still go camping and hunting, but never in that part of the San Juans again, and I never hike without a sidearm now. The thing that still haunts me most isn't just what we saw, but how it made me feel. There was something deeply, primally wrong about that creature. It wasn't just fear. It was this overwhelming sense that we had seen something we weren't supposed to see, something that didn't belong in our world, or at least in our understanding of it. I've spent 25 years trying to convince myself that there's a logical explanation. Maybe it was a person in some kind of costume or suit, though that doesn't explain the speed or the way it moved. Maybe it was some undiscovered species. Maybe it was just a bear, and my mind played tricks on the details. But deep down, I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still wonder, if we had followed it, what would we have found? And worse, what if it had seen us too? I've never gone public with this story until now. Mark would probably be upset if he knew I was sharing it, but I needed to get it off my chest. And maybe, just maybe, someone else has seen something similar in those mountains and can tell me I'm not crazy. The worst part is not knowing, not having an explanation, having this experience that fundamentally changed how I see the world, but having no framework to understand it, no closure. All I know is that on that July afternoon in 1998, something impossible ran across that clearing on Twin Sisters, and nothing anyone says, not scientists, not skeptics, not even my own rational mind, can convince me otherwise. Story 13. I still can't believe it's been over 40 years since that night. Even now, with my hair gone gray and my kids grown with families of their own, I remember every detail like it was yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory, and no matter how much time passes, they stay just as vivid. It was the summer of '80. I was stationed at Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington, working as an aircraft maintenance specialist. I'd managed to get a 2-week leave, and my wife Linda and I had decided to take the kids camping at Roosevelt Lake. Our daughter Amy was 7, and our son Michael was 5, perfect ages for their first real camping trip. We'd spent a wonderful week at the lake, swimming, fishing, telling stories around the campfire, the whole Norman Rockwell experience. But on the 5th night, Linda came down with some kind of stomach bug. We toughed it out for another day, but she wasn't getting better, so we decided to cut the trip short and head back home. We packed up camp that evening, loaded the station wagon, and got on the road around 10 at night. The kids were exhausted from all the outdoor activity and fell asleep almost immediately in the back seat. Linda was curled up in the passenger seat with a blanket, still feeling awful. I figured driving through the night would be better than trying to find a motel at that point. We'd just push through and be home by morning. The drive was peaceful. Something about driving at night always calmed me. Just me, the road, and the occasional trucker passing by. We were heading eastbound on Highway 2, cutting through Colville National Forest. The forest in that area is dense, tall pines on both sides of the road that seem to swallow all the light. The moon was out that night, nearly full, casting an eerie silver glow over the landscape. It was cool for summer, probably in the low 60s, and I had the windows cracked just enough to keep me alert with fresh air. By around 2 in the morning, we were deep in the forest, and I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. The road was completely deserted. I had the radio on low, some late-night talk show discussing politics or UFOs or something. Just enough noise to keep me company while everyone else slept. I remember checking the speedometer and seeing I was doing about 80 miles per hour, probably too fast, but the road was straight. Visibility was good with my high beams on, and I was eager to get Linda home to our own bathroom and bed. That's when I first noticed it up ahead. 2 red reflections in the middle of the road. Nothing unusual about that. Animals' eyes often reflect headlights that way. I figured it was a deer or maybe an elk. They're all over that area, and they frequently freeze in headlights. I eased off the gas a little, expecting whatever it was to bound away as I got closer, but it didn't move. The reflections just got bigger as I approached, and suddenly I realized they were much higher off the ground than any deer's eyes should be, way too high, and they weren't moving at all. I hit the brakes, hard. The station wagon's tires screamed against the asphalt, and I could smell burning rubber as blue smoke billowed up around us. Linda jolted awake, and I heard Amy cry out from the back seat, startled from her sleep. "Bob, what's happening?" Linda grabbed the dashboard, her knuckles white. I couldn't answer her. As the smoke from the tires cleared, I was staring at something I still can't fully process to this day. Standing directly in front of our car, illuminated in the high beams, was something. Not an animal, at least not any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. It was tall, impossibly tall. I spent 8 years in the Air Force, and I can estimate distances pretty accurately. This thing had to be at least 11 feet high, maybe more. It was standing perfectly still, perfectly calm, like our screeching arrival didn't bother it at all. The creature was covered in fur, a dark, reddish-brown color, almost like mahogany. But what struck me was how clean the fur looked, how well kept. Not matted or dirty like you'd expect from a wild animal. It was slim but solid, not skinny, just efficiently built, I guess you'd say. And its arms, God, its arms hung down almost to its knees. Long, powerful-looking limbs that seemed almost out of proportion. But it was the face that I'll never forget. Not exactly human, but not entirely animal either. The eyes were what I'd seen reflecting in my headlights. Large, round, and a deep, unsettling red that seemed to glow from within. They weren't reflecting my headlights anymore. They were generating their own light. The station wagon had come to a complete stop about 15 feet from this thing. The engine was still running, and I had a death grip on the steering wheel. I don't think I was breathing. Nobody in the car made a sound. Even the kids seemed to understand that making noise would be dangerous. For what felt like an eternity, though my watch later told me it was about 90 seconds, we just stared at each other. This thing, this creature, was looking right at me. Not at the car, not at the headlights, but directly at me. There was intelligence in those eyes, awareness. I felt like it was evaluating me, sizing me up, deciding something. Then, in a motion that still gives me chills, it slowly turned its head to look to its left, toward the field that ran alongside the highway. But the way it turned, its head rotated much farther than any human or animal head should be able to. It was like watching something with no bone structure, just a smooth, unnatural swivel that went well beyond normal range of motion. After looking at the field, its body followed the direction of its head. With just 2 long, gliding strides, it moved. From the center of the road to the edge. Each step covered what must have been 6 or 7 feet. There was an effortlessness to its movement, a strange grace that seemed impossible for something so large. At the edge of the road, it paused. Then, in that same disturbing manner, it rotated its head again, much too far, and looked back at me. Just me. Not at Linda, not at the kids in the back. Its red eyes locked with mine for maybe 5 seconds, though it felt much longer. Then it turned away and continued across the open field toward the tree line, which was about 50 feet from the road's edge. It moved with that same impossible grace. Not quite walking, not quite floating, but something in between. When it reached the edge of the forest, it stopped once more and turned that unsettling head all the way back toward our car. One final look. Then it did something I still can't explain. It took one enormous sideways step, not forward into the forest, but laterally along the tree line, and simply vanished. Not like it walked behind a tree or ducked into the underbrush. It was there, and then with that one step, it wasn't. Like it had stepped through a doorway that I couldn't see. Throughout the entire encounter, the creature never made a sound. Not a footfall, not a breath, nothing. But as we sat there, frozen in our car, I noticed a smell seeping in through the cracked windows. It was like rotten eggs or sulfur, strong enough to make my eyes water. I quickly rolled up the windows, but the stench had already filled the car. "Dad? What was that?" Michael's small voice came from the back seat. I couldn't answer him. What could I possibly say? "Bob, let's go. Please, let's just go." Linda's voice was trembling. She had her hand on my arm, squeezing so tight it hurt. I nodded, put the car in gear, and slowly drove forward. As we passed the spot where the creature had been standing, I felt a cold spot in the air, like driving through a pocket of freezing temperature. The car's engine sputtered for a moment, and the headlights dimmed briefly before returning to normal. We drove in complete silence for the next hour. The kids eventually fell back asleep, but Linda and I stayed wide awake, barely breathing. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those red eyes following us. When we finally reached the next town, I think it was Colville, I pulled into an all-night gas station and just sat there, hands shaking too badly to even pump gas. Linda and I talked about it in whispers while the kids slept. She had seen it too, confirmed every detail I had noticed. It wasn't my imagination, it wasn't a trick of the light or road fatigue. Whatever that thing was, it had been real. When we got home, I debated reporting it. I was active duty military. What would my commanding officer think if I came in talking about an 11-foot-tall creature on Highway 2? In the end, I called the local ranger station anonymously, just saying I'd seen something unusual in that area and they might want to check it out. The ranger who answered sounded bored and uninterested. I doubt they ever looked into it. Over the years, I've researched everything I could about that area. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, of course, but what we saw doesn't match those descriptions. Bigfoot is supposed to be bulky, ape-like. This was something else entirely, something leaner, more deliberate in its movements, more aware. I found a few similar accounts from that same stretch of highway, mostly truckers and late-night drivers. Always the same details, the height, the red eyes, the unnatural head rotation, the way it moves, and always that sulfur smell afterward. I retired from the Air Force in 1993 and never told anyone outside my immediate family about what happened. Even now, I'm using a throwaway account to post this. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone. I just need to get this story out there because I'm getting older, and I don't want this experience to die with me. I've never driven that stretch of Highway 2 since that night. We've taken detours, adding hours to trips just to avoid it. I've never gone camping again either, much to my children's disappointment when they were growing up. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what I saw, it's the feeling I had while looking into those eyes, the absolute certainty that it was looking back at me with at least as much intelligence as I was looking at it with. Maybe more, and the way it deliberately showed itself to us, then just as deliberately walked away, like it was sending a message. To this day, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking I can smell that sulfur odor in the darkness of my bedroom. And for just a moment, I'm convinced that if I turn on the light, I'll see those red eyes staring back at me. Story 14. I've never really told this story in full before. I mean, my brother and the other guys who were there know what happened, but we don't talk about it much. It's been over 30 years now, but I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear that sound again, that rhythmic chopping against the logs. This happened back in 1987 when I was 13. We lived in rural Missouri, out where the nearest neighbor was about a mile away, and the closest town was a 20-minute drive. My parents had this big property that backed up to our neighbor's even bigger property, mostly dense forest that stretched for miles. Me, my brother Tom, he was 15 then, and some friends had spent that summer building a cabin about 3 miles into our neighbor's woods. Mr. Peterson, our neighbor, knew about it and was cool with us being out there. We'd worked our asses off on that thing, hauling logs, scavenging materials from my dad's workshop, even borrowing supplies from construction sites near town. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, maybe 12 by 15 feet, with a sloped tin roof we'd pieced together from scrap. The door was just plywood we'd cut down and hung on these old rusty hinges. There was about an 8-inch gap at the top of the door where we couldn't get it to fit right. We'd stuffed feed bags between the logs as insulation, which in hindsight was probably a fire hazard with our kerosene lamps. But we were kids. Inside, we'd built these makeshift bunks. Tom and I shared one in the northeast corner. There were also some rafters where you could sleep if you didn't mind the spiders, and a couple other bunks along the walls. We were pretty damn proud of it. That weekend in October, 5 of us were out there. Me, Tom, Mr. Peterson's son Kyle, and 2 friends from the city, Mark and Jason, who'd come to visit for the weekend. It was a Friday night, and we'd hiked out there with our sleeping bags, some snacks, and our guns. Yeah, we all had guns. That wasn't weird where we grew up. I had my Remington 12 gauge that my grandpa had given me when I turned 12. It got dark early, around 6:30, and we spent the evening playing cards by lamplight. Penny poker mostly. We told ghost stories, ate beef jerky and candy bars, and just hung out like kids do. Around 1 in the morning, we finally decided to turn in. The night was cold, probably in the low 40s, and we could see our breath inside the cabin. We all crawled into our respective bunks, me and Tom in the northeast corner, Mark on the top bunk, Jason in the rafters, and Kyle in the wall bunk. We'd been quiet for maybe 30 minutes. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. At first it sounded like someone tapping on the logs, right by where Tom and I were lying. Tap, tap, tap. Then it got louder, more like chop, chop, chop. It sounded exactly like an axe hitting wood, right outside the cabin wall. Tom sat up first. "Who's out there?" he called. The chopping continued, steady and deliberate. "Probably just Jake and them trying to scare us," Kyle said, referring to some other kids from school who knew about our cabin. Tom called out again, louder this time. "We know it's you guys. Cut it out." But the chopping just kept going, methodical and unhurried. It was definitely coming from the northeast corner, right where our bunk was. I could feel the vibration through the logs with each strike. Mark turned on his flashlight. "Maybe we should check it out." "I'll shoot whoever's out there," Tom threatened, reaching for his .22 rifle. We all had our guns within reach. That was just how it was out in the country. You never knew when you might run into a coyote or something. "We're armed in here," Tom shouted. "You better stop that right now." The chopping paused for maybe 5 seconds, then started up again, even louder. That's when I felt the first real twinge of fear. If it was our friends playing a prank, they would have stopped or said something. I grabbed my shotgun and chambered around, making sure the sound was loud enough to be heard outside. The metallic clack echoed in the small cabin. The chopping stopped again, briefly, then resumed. Whatever was out there didn't care that we had guns. Tom's face had gone pale in the dim light of Mark's flashlight. Without warning, he pointed his rifle at the wall where the chopping was coming from and fired a shot through the logs. The report was deafening in the small space. Our ears were ringing, and the smell of gunpowder filled the cabin. The chopping stopped. "You got 'em," Jason whispered from up in the rafters. But about 2 minutes later, the chopping started again, in the exact same spot. It was like whatever was out there didn't even care that Tom had just fired a gun at it. "What the hell?" Kyle had his shotgun now too. We were all sitting up, staring at the wall where the sound was coming from. Tom fired again, and then a third time. The chopping stopped after the third shot, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps moving around the outside of the cabin. Not a person's footsteps. These were too heavy, too deliberate. And they were bipedal. 2 feet, not 4. Whatever it was walking upright. The footsteps circled around to the front of the cabin, to the plywood door. We all had our guns pointed in that direction now. I remember my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my shotgun. Then it happened. Something leaned down and peered through that 8-inch gap at the top of the door. I only caught a glimpse of it in the dim light, a face covered in dark, short hair, with large eyes that reflected the lamplight and a heavy brow ridge. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen, and it definitely wasn't human. Mark screamed, and we all opened fire at once. 5 guns going off in that tiny cabin was like a bomb exploding. We riddled that plywood door with holes. I emptied my shotgun, the buckshot tearing chunks out of the wood. The thing outside moved away from the door. We could hear those heavy footsteps again, moving to the east side of the cabin. Then there was a tremendous crash as something smashed down part of the tin roof on that side. Jason was screaming now, scrambling down from the rafters as pieces of the roof caved in. We fired up at the roof, at the walls, at anything that moved or made a sound. I don't know how many rounds we went through. I just kept reloading and firing until my shoulder was bruised from the shotgun's recoil. There was a moment of silence after our last volley. We were all breathing hard, ears ringing, the cabin filled with gun smoke. "We need to get help," Tom said, his voice shaking. "We need to get to the four-wheeler and ride to Kyle's house." The four-wheeler was parked about 50 yards from the cabin. The idea of going outside terrified me, but staying in the cabin with that thing trying to get in was worse. "I'll go with you," I said to Tom. "The rest of you keep shooting if it comes back." Tom and I stood by the door, our guns ready. Kyle, Mark, and Jason positioned themselves around the cabin, covering different walls. "On three," Tom said. "1, 2, 3. He yanked the door open and we bolted outside. The night air was cold on my face as we sprinted toward where we'd left the four-wheeler. I kept expecting to feel something grab me from behind, but we made it to the vehicle. Tom jumped on and I climbed on behind him, still clutching my shotgun. The engine roared to life and Tom gunned it down the rough trail that led toward Kyle's house. We bounced over roots and rocks, the headlight barely illuminating the path ahead. Every shadow in the woods looked like it might be that thing following us. It took us maybe 15 minutes to reach Kyle's house. We skidded to a stop in their yard and ran to the door, pounding on it frantically. Mr. Peterson came to the door with a shotgun of his own. "What in God's name?" he started. "Something's at the cabin," Tom shouted. "Something's trying to get in. The others are still there." Mr. Peterson didn't ask questions. He grabbed his keys, told his wife to call the sheriff, and we all piled into his pickup truck. He had a rifle rack in the back window with a high-powered hunting rifle that he grabbed before we peeled out of the driveway. The drive back seemed to take forever, even though Mr. Peterson was flooring it down the logging roads. When we finally reached the point where we had to go on foot, we all jumped out, flashlights and guns ready. We could hear sporadic gunfire from the direction of the cabin as we approached. Mr. Peterson led the way, moving faster than I would have thought possible for a man his size. When we reached the cabin, Kyle, Mark, and Jason were still inside, but they'd stopped shooting. They said whatever it was had moved off into the woods after smashing part of the roof. Mr. Peterson didn't waste any time. "Everyone in the truck now. We're getting out of here." No one argued. We piled into his pickup, all 7 of us crammed in somehow, and he drove us back to his house. None of us talked much on the ride back. What was there to say? We'd all seen something that shouldn't exist. The next morning, Mr. Peterson went back out to the cabin with some other men from the area. They found the place shot to hell, just like we'd left it. There were deep gouges in the logs where something had been chopping at them, not clean cuts like from an axe, but rough tears in the wood. And they found prints around the cabin, big prints that Mr. Peterson said weren't bear tracks. They were too narrow, too long, almost like a huge human footprint, but not quite. For 30 years I've never gone back to that cabin. None of us have. Tom and I never even talked about it much, except late at night sometimes when we'd both had a few beers. Over the years, I'd hear strange screams from the woods behind my parents' house, especially in the fall. Mr. Peterson reported having things stolen from his tool shed and hunting cabin, food mostly, but also clothes and blankets. I moved away after college, but even now when I visit my parents, I won't go into those hills. Whatever was out there that night is probably long gone, but I can't shake the memory of that face peering through the gap in the door, those eyes reflecting the lamplight, those heavy footsteps circling our cabin. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. In them, I'm back in that bunk, and I hear that steady chopping at the logs, getting closer and closer until the wall finally gives way. Story 15. I never really believed in the whole Bigfoot thing. I mean, come on. Giant hairy apes wandering around North America without anyone getting clear evidence. Seemed like total BS to me. But something happened to me 20 years ago that I still can't explain. I've only told this story to close friends, but I need to get it off my chest. It was the summer of 2003, and my entire family had pitched in to rent this massive houseboat on Lake Norris in Ohio for a week. There were 10 of us: my parents, my aunt and uncle, my grandparents, my sister and her husband, and my wife Sarah and me. I was 25 at the time, recently back from a tour overseas and working as a state highway patrolman. I mention that because I want you to understand. I'm trained to observe, to stay calm in stressful situations, and to report facts accurately. What I saw that day wasn't a hallucination or some kind of misidentification. The first few days on the lake were amazing. We were cruising around, fishing, swimming, drinking beers, playing cards, just normal family vacation stuff. On the third day, we found this perfect little secluded cove in one of the fjords. Lake Norris has all these little inlets and secluded areas, and we'd found a spot where we hadn't seen another boat all day. We anchored the houseboat about 30 feet from shore, and everyone was just lounging around. Around mid-afternoon, Sarah suggested we explore the woods a bit. She's always been outdoorsy, loves hiking and nature photography, so I wasn't surprised. We took some water bottles, my pocket knife, habit from both military and police work, and headed to shore on the little dinghy. The shoreline was rocky but manageable, and there was a clear game trail leading up the hillside. It was pretty steep, I'd guess a 30 to 40 degree incline, but we were both in good shape and took it slow. The forest was dense, mostly oak and maple with lots of undergrowth. It was hot, probably in the mid-80s, and the humidity made everything feel damp. I remember swatting mosquitoes constantly and wiping sweat from my eyes. We'd been hiking for maybe 45 minutes when we came across something strange. There was a cleared area, maybe 12 feet in diameter, where the ground cover was completely flattened. Not just stepped on, but pressed down in a circular pattern, like something had been lying there. At first I thought it was a deer bed, but it was way too big. Then I figured maybe a black bear, which wouldn't be completely unheard of in that area, though pretty rare. "Should we head back?" Sarah asked, looking uneasy. "Nah, bears aren't usually aggressive unless you surprise them with cubs," I said. "Let's just make some noise as we walk." So we continued uphill, talking loudly, occasionally clapping. About 20 minutes later, the woods suddenly opened up, and we found ourselves at the edge of a plateau. It was this big, open field covered in tall grass, like prairie grass that came up to around my chest. I'm 6 feet tall. The grass was this yellowish-brown color, swaying in the breeze. From where we stood, we could see across the entire plateau, maybe 200 yards to the tree line on the other side. Sarah took out her camera and started snapping pictures of the view. You could see parts of the lake from up there, glittering through the trees below. It was peaceful, just the sound of insects buzzing and birds calling. We decided to walk through the field to get to the highest point for a better view. We'd gone maybe 30 yards in when Sarah grabbed my arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze across the field. At first, I didn't notice anything, but then I saw movement. The grass was shifting in one specific area, maybe 100 yards away, but not from the wind. This was different, more deliberate. "Probably a deer," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt a chill. The movement pattern wasn't right for a deer. We stood frozen, watching. Then it stood up. I'm going to try to describe this as accurately as possible. From where we were standing, we could see a figure rise up from the grass. It was massive, towering at least 2 to 3 feet above the grass, which put it at around 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown hair, not black like you often hear in Bigfoot stories, but a muddy, dirty brown color. The hair looked matted in places, especially around what I assume was the shoulders. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance, but the silhouette was unmistakably humanoid, standing on two legs with proportionally long arms and a large, somewhat conical head that seemed to sit directly on the shoulders without much of a neck. Time seemed to stop. The thing was just standing there, completely still, facing directly at us. I don't know how long we stared at each other, probably only seconds, but it felt like minutes. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but it broke the spell. The creature immediately turned and began moving away from us. It didn't run exactly. It was more like a smooth, fast walk with a longer stride than any human could manage. It moved through the grass with no apparent effort, reached the embankment on the far side of the plateau, and started climbing up the steep hill beyond the field. The speed and agility with which it scaled that incline was incredible, like it was barely affected by gravity. Within seconds, it disappeared into the tree line. Sarah was shaking violently beside me. "What the fuck was that?" she gasped. My mind was racing through possibilities. Bear standing on hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong and the movement was too fluid. A person in a suit, in the middle of nowhere in sweltering heat. No way. My training kicked in and I tried to focus on observable facts rather than jumping to conclusions, but there was no rational explanation I could come up with. "We need to go," I said, turning back toward the way we'd come. We had just reached the edge of the field when we heard it. A crashing sound from the trees where the creature had disappeared. I looked back and saw the grass moving again, this time faster, more purposeful. It was coming back, and it was coming toward us. "Run," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Now!" We hit the tree line and started down the trail. The slope that had been challenging on the way up was now dangerous as hell on the way down. Sarah was in front of me, and I kept telling her to slow down, to watch her footing, but she was in full panic mode. "It's following us," she cried, and I could hear it too, branches breaking, leaves rustling, something large moving through the forest behind us. The sounds were erratic but getting closer. "Sarah, slow down, you're going to..." But before I could finish, she lost her footing on the steep trail. She slid several feet, scraping her hands and knees on rocks and roots before managing to stop herself. I helped her up, and we kept going more carefully, but still as fast as we could manage. The sounds behind us continued, sometimes seeming to fade, then suddenly closer again, as if whatever was following us knew the terrain and was cutting across switchbacks to intercept. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My legs burned from the rapid descent. Sarah was sobbing, gasping for breath. I remember thinking that if this thing wanted to catch us, it probably could have already. Was it herding us, playing with us? The thought made me sick. We finally broke through the tree line near the shore. The houseboat was right where we'd left it, my family visible on the deck, some swimming in the water near the boat. I've never been so relieved to see people in my life. We splashed through the shallows to the dinghy, and I practically threw Sarah in before jumping in myself and starting the small outboard motor. As we pulled away from shore, I looked back at the tree line. Nothing visible, but the leaves were still rustling slightly in one area, about 20 yards in from the shore. By the time we reached the houseboat, Sarah was hysterical. My sister helped her aboard, while my dad and brother-in-law pulled me up. Everyone was staring at us, confused and concerned. Sarah's knees and palms were bleeding from her fall. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and I realized I was shaking. "What happened? Were you attacked by something?" my dad asked, looking at Sarah's injuries. I tried to explain as calmly as I could what we'd seen. As I spoke, I watched their expressions change from concern to disbelief to awkward sympathy, like they thought we'd had some kind of shared hallucination or panic attack. My brother-in-law even laughed nervously until he saw the look on my face. "You're serious," he said. "Dead serious," I replied. We moved the houseboat that afternoon, traveling several miles to a more populated area of the lake. Sarah refused to go near the shoreline for the rest of the trip. I couldn't blame her. That night, I kept waking up thinking I heard something moving outside the boat. 20 years later, I still think about what we saw. I've read everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings in Ohio. There have been others in the Lake Norris area over the years. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back, try to find evidence. But then I remember the way that thing moved, how easily it navigated terrain that had us stumbling and gasping for breath. And I think maybe some things are better left alone. I still work in law enforcement. I deal in facts, evidence, provable things. But I know what I saw that day, and nothing, not science, not skepticism, not 20 years of rational thinking, has been able to explain it away. Story 16. I've never told this to anyone outside my family before. I'm still not sure I should be sharing it now, but after 5 years, the memory of that morning still wakes me up in a cold sweat sometimes. I need to get this off my chest. I was 19, a sophomore in college, and had come home for Thanksgiving break. Anyone who knows South Louisiana knows duck hunting is practically a religion down here. My dad had taught me to hunt. When I was 8, and every season since, we'd been out in the swamps and marshes before dawn. That morning, though, Dad had to help my younger sister with some school project, so I went out alone to our usual spot in the flooded fields near Bayou Mallet. It was the last weekend of November, cool but not cold, typical Louisiana fall weather, maybe 50 degrees with a light fog hanging over the water. I'd left the house around 5 in the morning, riding my four-wheeler through the darkness with just my headlamp cutting through the mist. The path was so familiar I could have navigated it blindfolded, down the dirt road behind our property, across Old Man Thibodeau's fallow field. He always let us cross during hunting season, then following the ridgeline until it dipped down toward the flooded timber where the ducks like to rest. I parked my four-wheeler on high ground about a quarter mile from my hunting spot. Didn't want the noise to spook any birds. I grabbed my shotgun, ammo bag, and thermos of coffee, then made the rest of the trek on foot, sloshing through ankle-deep water in my waders. My spot wasn't anything fancy, just a natural blind formed where a big water oak had fallen during last year's hurricane. The exposed root system and fallen branches created perfect cover, and the water around it was just deep enough to attract ducks, but shallow enough for me to stand. I settled in around 5:45, about 30 minutes before sunrise, arranging a few decoys in the water in front of me. Then I just waited, sipping coffee from my thermos lid. That's the thing about hunting. There's a lot of waiting, just you and the swamp waking up around you. I've always loved those quiet moments, watching the world come alive as the first hints of light filter through the cypress trees. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon when I heard it, movement in the water behind me. My first thought was that Dad had finished helping my sister and decided to join. Me after all. Or maybe my cousin Mike had shown up. He sometimes came by if he knew I was hunting alone. I didn't turn around right away, not wanting to spook any ducks that might be flying in. But then I noticed something was off. The footsteps were heavy, too heavy for a person, and there was no splashing like someone walking in waders, just steady, deliberate movements like something big was carefully placing each foot. I slowly turned my head, thinking maybe it was a black bear. We get them sometimes in the swamp, though they usually avoid people. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. About 30 feet behind me, emerging from a stand of cypress, was the largest creature I've ever seen in my life. It was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall, and covered in thick black hair with reddish-brown patches around its shoulders and back. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in hands that looked disturbingly human-like, only much larger. My first coherent thought was, that's not a bear. My second was, holy shit, that's a Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I'd have laughed them off. But there was no mistaking what I was seeing. This wasn't some guy in a suit or my imagination playing tricks on me in the early morning light. This was a living, breathing creature that shouldn't exist, but was standing right there in front of me. I froze completely, didn't even breathe. I was partially hidden by the fallen tree and my camo gear, and thankfully the wind was blowing toward me, not away. The creature hadn't noticed me yet. It moved to the edge of the water, maybe 25 feet from where I was crouched. Then it squatted down on its haunches, almost like a person would, and began to drink from the water. Its face, God, its face. It had deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge, a flat, wide nose, and a mouth that seemed almost too small for its massive head. The face wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. Something in between that made my skin crawl. I remained absolutely still, my knuckles white from gripping my shotgun. Not that I planned to use it. What the hell would a 12-gauge do against something that size? But it was the only thing keeping me from completely losing it. I remember thinking that if it charged me, I'd have exactly one shot before it reached me, and I doubted that would be enough. The creature drank for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or so. Then it straightened up to its full height, water dripping from its chin. It surveyed the swamp, looking right past where I was hidden. I swear it sniffed the air a couple of times, and I thought for sure it would pick up my scent. Instead, it turned and began walking along the water's edge, away from me. Its gait was strange, not quite like a person walking, more fluid and rolling with longer strides. Each step covered about twice what mine would. I watched as it moved along the shoreline for about 150 yards, then disappeared into a dense patch of cypress and palmetto. The moment it was out of sight, the paralysis that had gripped me broke. I didn't even think about the ducks or finishing my hunt. I splashed through the water as fast as my waders would allow, not caring about the noise. When I reached my four-wheeler, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I've never driven so recklessly in my life. I nearly flipped the four-wheeler twice, taking corners too fast on the way home. My mind was racing faster than the engine. What the hell had I just seen? Was I losing it? Had someone slipped something into my coffee? But I knew what I'd seen was real. As impossible as it seemed, that thing had been right there, close enough that I could have hit it with a rock if I'd been stupid enough to try. I burst into the house just after 7:30. Dad was in the kitchen making breakfast, and he knew something was wrong the second he saw my face. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. In a way, I had. "What happened? Are you hurt?" he asked, putting down the spatula he was holding. The words tumbled out of me in a rush. I told him everything. The size of the creature, the reddish patches in its black hair, the way it drank from the water, how it moved. Dad listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I expected him to tell me I was seeing things, that it was probably just a bear, or that I dozed off and had a vivid dream. Instead, he asked, "Can you show me where?" That was the last thing I wanted to do. Go back there. No way. But Dad was insistent. He grabbed his rifle from the gun safe, and after some argument, I reluctantly got back on my four-wheeler and led him to the spot. The morning had warmed up by then, and the fog had burned off. In the clear light of day, the swamp looked normal, peaceful even. But I knew what I'd seen. "Show me exactly where it was standing," Dad said. I pointed to the spot at the water's edge. Dad approached cautiously, scanning the tree line as he went. When he reached the location, he crouched down to examine the ground. After a moment, he waved me over. "Look at this," he said quietly. There, pressed into the soft mud at the water's edge, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. It was enormous, at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. A few yards away was another, then another, forming a trail that led in the direction the creature had walked. Dad's face had gone pale. He'd been hunting these swamps for over 40 years and knew every animal that lived here. This wasn't a bear track, a deer track, or anything else that should exist in South Louisiana. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight. "Now!" We didn't speak much on the ride home. What was there to say? The evidence was right there in the mud. Whatever I'd seen was real, and both of us knew it. When we got back to the house, Dad poured himself a stiff drink, which was unusual for him, especially before noon. He sat at the kitchen table, staring into his glass for a long time before he finally spoke. "When I was about your age," he began slowly, "I was hunting alone down in the Atchafalaya Basin. I saw something moving through the cypress trees, bigger than a man, covered in dark hair. I only caught a glimpse of it, and I convinced myself it was a bear standing on its hind legs." He took a sip of his drink. "But it wasn't a bear. I've known that for 30 years, but I never told anyone. Who would believe me? We agreed not to tell anyone outside the family. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be the laughing stocks of the parish. But Dad did take some photos of the tracks with his phone before we left. I haven't been back to that spot since. Can't bring myself to go there, even with company. I still hunt, but always in different areas, always with someone else. I keep my back to solid ground and my eyes on the tree line. 5 years have passed, and I've tried to convince myself that there's some logical explanation for what I saw. But then I remember those tracks in the mud, and my dad's face when he saw them. I remember the way that creature moved. Not like any animal I've ever seen, but not quite human either. I don't know what it was. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists, and it's out there in the swamps of South Louisiana, drinking from the same waters where we hunt ducks and fish for catfish. Sometimes at night, I still hear those heavy footsteps in my dreams.